Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. It is Saturday night at 8, and this is Joe Firestone for Real Progressives. And my guest for tonight will be the congressional primary candidate for the Florida 23rd, Timothy Canova. Okay, and Tim is going to be joining us for a good, healthy session tonight to discuss with me fixing our broken democracy. And I hope we can find some remedies for it because it's really broken.
Really is. Thank you, Joe.
Okay, sure, Tim. So we've already got 14 people over there, so I think we can start talking, and I'm sure the rest will be joining in a couple of moments. Yeah, it has now gone up to 23 people as we speak, and pretty soon it should be in the 50 and up range. So I don't know if I'm actually showing you yet. Let's see. People will tell us if we both are showing on the screen. 8 reactions and live. Let's see if there are live comments yet.
Joe, I'm going to grab a glass of water so that I don't start coughing in the middle of this.
Okay, great, Tim. Hello, Tim and Joe. Okay, I guess you can see us, huh, folks? Okay, somebody started off with a comment that was extremely interesting, and so I thought it was worthwhile conveying the comment to you, Tim. It's, let me see if I can find it again. DLJ says, the broken democracy implies there exists a democracy and it is broken. It strikes me the same as a transgender operation. You change but one gender into another, and this change is not a fully functional change, only a semblance of change. To the oligarchic plutocracies, you cannot just append a couple of features and turn these totalitarian regimes into democracies. Oligarchic plutocracies can never be fixed into democracies. Capitalism, predicated on economic inequality, is antithetical to democracy. Okay, and then there's a equality of influence on government. It's this terminology that needs fixing first. Only then can we proceed to fix into oblivion the plutocracies that exist. And on their ashes, we can start building our democracies. So that comment was an interesting one. I think we'll get around to answering that in some way. But I'd like to start with you, Tim, and see what your ideas are as to how to fix our democracy. And I'll take the promo out of the way now.
Sure. I appreciate that. And, to that comment that you just read, I think it's helpful to look at democracy as a spectrum, between, I guess, an ideal type of a democracy, and on one end of the spectrum, what we have now is certainly not much of a democracy at all. And I would also agree that there is this inherent tension between democracy and the kind of capitalism we have right now. I think we can look back some decades ago and see a different type of capitalism, perhaps one where small businesses and family-owned businesses, Main Street type of capitalism was flourishing. Now we've got a real type of Wall Street crony cartel capitalism. And when you look at the problem in that nature, it suggests that to fix democracy or to restore some semblance of a real functioning democracy, we have to address the kinds of great inequalities in power that we see in our society right now.
So how would you go about trying to reduce these or change the nature, of power in our society? Well, what kinds of changes would you recommend?
Sure. When you look at our political system, it's awash in special interest money and money from huge corporations and big Wall Street banks. So we have to reduce the influence of this kind of money in our politics. I'm all for campaign finance reform, publicly financed elections. I think we need to open up the broadcast spectrum. Walter Cronkite, near the end of his life, the last few years of his life, he was working with Common Cause for a project for free airtime. The idea being that these big broadcast companies owe their existence to we the people, to the taxpayer. These are public airwaves. We essentially have privatized them, handed them over to these huge corporations for free, and then we have to lease them back at campaign time, which means candidates have to raise an awful lot of money just to get their 30 seconds on TV to communicate with the voters. The kind of campaign that we're running here in South Florida is a very different campaign. We don't take any money from any corporate interests, none of the political action committees, none of those industry PACs, none of the super PACs, and we're trying to do it by raising money in small donations online. We were very successful in raising a lot of money last year's campaign, and of course, inspired by the way Bernie Sanders was doing it. And I think you could even trace it back to 2008 in Barack Obama's first campaign. He raised an awful lot of money online that way. And, I've made a pledge that we won't take any special interest money. We're going to do this very principled way. And, we've got a long fundraising list from the last campaign. 2017 was a slow year. It was an off year. And now we're revving up for 2018. So I think if we can stay true to taking money only from the people, from grassroots donations, that means when elected, we're not beholden to those special interests. It really is the influence of money in politics that's so corrosive. And I recall watching one of your live streams before, where you talked about overturning Citizens United. And, I'm a law professor, and I'm all for overturning Citizens United as well. And, of course, the problem is the Supreme Court in Citizens United and in a number of other major decisions has taken this view of the First Amendment that's very corrosive for democracy. So how do you overturn a Supreme Court decision? You either need a constitutional amendment with supermajority support in the House, the Senate, and across the country in state legislatures. And I'm all for it, but realistically, it doesn't stand much chance in our present political environment, and it's hard to understand or to imagine having the kind of supermajority support in all of those institutions to overturn Citizens United. But I like
You're right, and it's also the case that it's probably a 6 to 7 year or a 10-year even process to actually get the constitutional amendment.
That's right.
Through. And what happens during those 10 years?
Exactly. The power of the oligarchy gets only stronger and stronger, and that goal of overturning Citizens United just recedes into the distance. But what I liked about your live stream, you raised an interesting question, which is Congress could overturn Citizens United through legislation, and in that legislation, essentially strip the courts of the jurisdiction to rule on that legislation. And when you first hear it, and I will say, I went to my Constitution and double-checked it, and you do seem to be on firm ground in making that argument. When you first suggest that to people, they say, well, listen, you're willing to throw out the separation of powers. But
no, that's what's in the Constitution.
Exactly. Our founders put that in the Constitution for the kind of case we're in right now, right, where our institutions, namely the Supreme Court, has gone off the tracks, and there's no other way to rein them in. So, I like that idea of yours, and I have repeated it a number of times already.
Okay, thank you. And I've heard you repeat it, but I had no way of knowing as to whether I was the origin or you got it from someone else, of course. Okay, because you're a law professor, so I figured you kind of knew that, already. But anyway, to get back to that, what I would do is a dual track thing. I would start with passing that and having the clause in there.
Mhm.
Okay. And then I would also go forward with a constitutional amendment, okay, as well. And, do both. I don't think there's any harm in, doing both. And a constitutional amendment, even if it took, 7 to 10 years to pass, would then secure it. But we would have an immediate cure for the problem.
Mhm.
Okay, so it's not as tough as a constitutional amendment. However, we would require control of the Senate and the House and the presidency to get that through, I think.
I agree with you on that. I'd say what is also needed to restore democracy in this country is to have real election integrity reforms. We've essentially privatized the ballot counting system around the country.
I know that's a disaster.
It has been a disaster. In many international rankings, the United States now ranks dead last among major democracies for election integrity. And people have lost their confidence and faith in the election counting, the vote counting system in this country. You look all over Western Europe, where democracies have banned the electronic voting machine.
And going back to paper ballots.
Back to paper ballots. And it's precisely because how easy it is to manipulate the software of these electronic voting systems. So in our last election, we decided after our last election just to put in a request to inspect the paper ballots. We put in our request just over a year ago to the Broward County Supervisor of Elections. And when we first made the request, we were told, first of all, that they had not done any digital scanned images of the ballots, which struck us as very strange. We didn't understand why they would not have done that. But we said, okay, let's move ahead and inspect the paper ballots. Not in the entire district. There are over 300 or about 300 precincts. But we figured let's select about a dozen of the key precincts and just verify the vote. There were a lot of folks who had been contacting me. Some who had done some statistical analysis of the vote in my race, and some who had anecdotal stories about voter suppression in my district. I just wanted the issue to kind of go away, so we could move on to Medicare for all and lots of other issues. So I figured the best way to do it is let's verify the vote and just inspect the ballots in a dozen precincts. It'll probably match up if everything's fine, right? And we got stonewalled for many months by the Supervisor of Elections office. And this past June, I filed a lawsuit under Florida's public records law, which is a very good law. And it's clear that paper ballots, scanned images, all of that are public records, and we should be permitted to inspect them. And in the course of that lawsuit, just some weeks ago, we discovered through the lawsuit that the Supervisor of Elections had destroyed all the paper ballots in our election, and they had done it this past September while the lawsuit was pending in violation of a federal legal requirement to keep the paper ballots for 22 months in a federal election, and in defiance of the court as well. I mean, this was a destruction of evidence. So the repercussions of it are very unclear at this point, the legal repercussions. Our election experts have told us that without the paper ballots, it's really difficult to verify the scanned images. And I should say the irony is that when they essentially informed us that we don't have paper ballots left in our race, they then informed us that, oh, well, we actually do have scanned images now. So we really don't know what to believe that they've been telling us. And we are going to pursue the legal case as far as we can.
Okay. So certainly one thing we can do about our democracy being so broken is to try to fix the voter suppression, that's going on.
Yes. And
also try to fix the machinery of the elections. And we can have some impact on that as we go forward, state by state, right?
Yes. Well,
in other words,
I'd like to say that about 2 months ago, I think, the New York City Board of Elections entered into a consent decree. They had been sued by private plaintiffs, and the U.S. Department of Justice joined into the lawsuit. And in that consent decree, a civil consent decree, the New York City Board of Elections admitted, they conceded that they had purged about 200,000 voters from the rolls in the days before their presidential primary, of course, pitting Bernie Sanders against Hillary Clinton.
Incredible.
And fortunately, Joe, they promised they won't ever do it again. We're supposed to be satisfied.
Thanks.
Yeah, exactly. It reminds me of those Wall Street settlements, right?
Yes, except it's even worse.
It is
because there was no money involved in this situation, right?
Exactly. So
I mean, at least the Wall Street is paid a token amount.
Exactly. I think it's shameful that there's not a criminal investigation and criminal prosecutions in the offing here. When you can purge 200,000 voters in the days before a key primary, and there's no criminal sanction, there is something seriously wrong. This is our most sacred right as Americans, the right to vote. Our democracy is broken. People have lost faith in the vote counting. And to have suppression on that scale in our own party, I mean, I am still a Democrat right now, to have that kind of a suppression and for Democrats not to be speaking out about it is shameful.
Okay, so what can we do about that?
Well, I think we have to speak out about it, and we have to demand that the Justice Department bring prosecution, or at least investigate this as a criminal matter. I think. Okay,
but is there any action we can take against the Democrats as a party for this? I mean, obviously, it had something to do with the Democrats suppressing the vote.
Sure. Look, my favored personal response to all of this corruption was to go after, to challenge the head of the Democratic National Committee. And while Wasserman Schultz is no longer the head of the DNC, she still represents all that is wrong in the party. And
I agree, and that's a good response. Okay, but at the same time, shouldn't there be more response in the New York area itself? Okay, in terms of people in the party there going after the state party for what happened.
There should be, and Joe, we're about to launch a petition calling for the Justice Department to investigate what the New York City Board of Elections did. And that petition will be up within a couple of weeks, and we'll be circulating it. So that's something tangible, and maybe if there are enough signatures on that petition, it starts getting the attention of the New York State Democratic Party.
Yeah, but is this a Department of Justice provision? That is a U.S. Department of Justice or a State Department of Justice?
Well, first of all, I think both have jurisdiction over this. You've got Eric Schneider,
yeah, I think so too,
State Attorney General, and you've got the Justice Department, and I think both should be investigating. One is obviously controlled by the Republicans, the Justice Department, but Eric Schneiderman is a Democrat in New York. I think both owe an obligation to the people of New York and to the American people to be investigating this and not letting it just be swept under the rug. And this is only one example, but it is probably one of the more visible examples of recent weeks.
Right. So do you think that Schneiderman is likely to pursue it?
I don't know. I certainly haven't been in touch with him. I will say I'm impressed with a lot of the things that he has done. I
am too.
Yeah, look, you take a look at politicians, and the old saying, I think, is true. They don't see the light until they feel the heat. And right. So I think if we can organize ourselves and get these petition drives moving and start publicizing them, maybe Eric Schneiderman and the Justice Department will see the wisdom in moving forward here.
Okay, so let's say that we go forward, okay, with all these things, because we would have to go forward in various states to make an impact. Mm-hmm. And probably some people would have to go to jail before we make an impact.
I think so. Look, economists.
Once the first person goes to jail, then people are going to be much more cautious about this.
Exactly. Economists refer to this as moral hazard.
Yes, I know what I refer to it the same way, as moral hazard.
And it is a moral hazard. Look, you take a look at how Wall Street was treated by the Justice Department in the 9 years since the financial collapse. And not a single criminal prosecution of anyone of consequence on Wall Street for the massive frauds that led to the collapse. And that's a major moral hazard among really the elites of this country. And if you can get away with that crime of the century, so to speak, what won't you try to get away with? So we shouldn't be so surprised that elite interests moved forward to try to suppress the vote and perhaps manipulate vote countings around the country. After all, they got away with a multi-trillion-dollar fraud, you could say.
Oh, they did. They did, absolutely. And as a result, there were many people who died.
The hardship remains 9 years after the collapse.
Yes, and it's not just the hardship here in the United States. Okay, in other words, the collapse in Europe, which was triggered here, had vast effects in Greece and Spain, okay, in Ireland.
Absolutely.
All over the world. These people have blood on their hands, actually, literally.
And you know, one thing to note is that when you have the kind of financial collapse and widespread economic hardship that we have been seeing around the world, a lot of it is not reported in the official government statistics in this country, like the official unemployment rate, but it is there. And when you have that kind of mass hardship, that creates the conditions in which right-wing populism and fascism flourish. So when we take a look at Western Europe and we see the rise of neo-Nazi and fascist political movements, and we see a similar trend happening in our country, this is not just happening because people wake up one day and decide that they are going to indulge their most racist, xenophobic influences. This is occurring because people have economic hardships. They do not know who to blame for it. And rather than blaming the elites, they are convinced by the elites to blame people below them.
Yes, I agree. That's exactly what's happening. We have the same analysis, okay, in common. And I think that we both think it's largely one of the consequences of the crash of 2008.
Yes.
So that is on their hands also. Okay. I agree, of course. We have to get to the stage where someone is going to treat the situation in a criminal way. But, of course, in order to get that done, we have to take over the political system again. Okay? And that's a tall order. And that gets to my next question, okay, which is, let's assume that we are successful in making the election system a fairer system, and that in consequence, we win control of the government in 2018 and in 2020. So then the question is, what do we do about the mass media? I mean, obviously, we've reached a situation where the media is almost a state press.
Yes.
They're reflecting the kind of consensus which the occupiers of government would like to see among us, and the kind of consensus which the military-industrial complex, okay, would like to see among us, okay, as well. And they do everything they can to maintain that consensus about the nature of the reality we live in, the economic reality, the international reality, the political reality, the permanence of the two-party system, but the whole thing, the inverted totalitarian system, as Chris Hedges likes to say.
Right.
Okay. And I think he's right. I think it is that kind of system, okay, that we live in now and that we have to overthrow. In fact, I'd even go further and say it's an inverted totalitarian system that now is tending towards a fascist system, because that's the transformation that Trump, okay, would like to effect if he possibly can do it.
Right.
Okay. So I think the key piece here is the media. So basically, how do we disintermediate the media?
Well,
I think that's a question we have to face.
I agree with you. I think this is a problem that goes back many years. Certainly,
Yes,
the 1990s was a watershed during the Clinton administration with the Telecommunications Deregulation Act. And we've seen a greater and greater concentration of media assets into fewer and fewer hands. You know, we talk a lot about the need for a Glass-Steagall Act to break up the big Wall Street banks. By the same token, we need a Glass-Steagall, so to speak, for the big media conglomerates as well. It's not enough to talk about a Glass-Steagall for Wall Street. We also want to have public banking, community banking. We should be thinking the same for our media sector as well. In addition to breaking up these huge conglomerates that have become very monopolistic in nature, we need to also have subsidies for a smaller community, public type of broadcasting around the country as well. The internet.
Okay, but to do that, we have to take over the government first.
Yes.
And one big thing that's against us in terms of taking over the government is the press and the line it's constantly reflecting.
That's true. And yet, take a look at last year's elections. Bernie Sanders, you know, an outsider in many ways. I know he's been inside the Beltway for a while, but, you know, he certainly was the insurgent candidate. He came pretty close under the circumstances to toppling perhaps the most entrenched political machine in our lifetime in the Democratic Party.
Yes, he did.
That entrenched machine, the Clinton machine, the Democratic National Committee, the Democratic establishment, I think had the support of most of that mainstream corporate media. And it still managed to lose that election to Donald Trump. So when you take a look at public opinion polls, Congress as an institution, I think, has favorability ratings in the single digits now.
Yes, I think so too.
And the mass media is right there with them. So a lot of folks, they read their local corporate-owned newspapers. They watch perhaps some corporate cable or corporate broadcast TV news, but they don't have the same deference. And you could say it's been splintered a bit into a Tower of Babel. There's lots of different voices and perspectives coming. So while it is a major problem, I don't think it's insurmountable.
Okay. Well, to some degree, I agree. But considering the Tower of Babel, I think that's a good way to describe it. We do have a Tower of Babel now. The person living in the middle of the Tower of Babel has a very tough time making sense of it. Cognitively reconstructing what the reality of the world is.
Yes.
That's the problem of the individual, okay, who lives in the middle.
Yes.
And who doesn't have a lot of time to spend on social media sorting out all the sources and trying to decide what actually makes sense to that person. So how do we deal with that?
Well, I look at it as one person running for an office who's got a platform now. What's within my control? All I can do is keep speaking the truth and hoping it resonates with folks. I take a look at last year's campaign here. You know, we came pretty close, assuming the vote count was accurate. We still came pretty close in a campaign that lasted less than 8 months in unseating a very entrenched politician.
Yes, right. And you might have won.
Right. Well, I don't disagree.
In fact, okay, you might have won.
Perhaps. You know, with the destruction of the paper ballots, it becomes difficult to verify the result. But even assuming the outcome was accurate, we came pretty close. And on that day of my primary, Florida voters voted for 2 referendums in which the corporate establishment was dead set against. One was solar energy, and the other was medical marijuana. And when I say Florida voters voted for these referendums, it required a 60% vote or higher. And in fact, more than 70% of Florida voters voted for both of these referendums. What I am finding is no matter what BS the media is shoveling, that conditions have become such in our society, the economic conditions and society has progressed in many ways that the people are way out ahead of the politicians and the political class on issue after issue. The special interests don't want Medicare for all. The public opinion polls show something like 80% plus of Democrats, 70% of independents, and 50-50 maybe now among Republicans want Medicare for all. I don't think that's necessarily because the media, I don't think it is because the media has somehow educated the voters towards that position. It's more because people in their own lives know what it's like to be screwed by these private insurers on a daily basis, that they pay through the nose for their premiums. When they need a doctor, they can't afford the deductibles, and everything gets denied by the insurance companies.
Yes.
So I just think the distribution of wealth, income, and power has gotten so top-heavy that this is one of those moments in American history that we hopefully will be able to look back on someday as being one of those progressive populist moments where the elites have just been discredited to such a degree that it opens a major space for us politically.
Okay, and I think I agree with that analysis also. We are getting a feedback. I'm not sure what the source of it is now.
Okay.
Okay, it seems to be better now. Okay. So I do agree with the analysis, but I am still wondering, okay, because what's really necessary here is to have a watershed election where most of our representatives lose either in primaries or in the general.
Yes.
Okay. We need to have that kind of revelation, the kind of thing that happened in 1933.
That's absolutely. Yes.
I'm sorry. Okay. In 1932.
Right.
But the change took place. Okay. In 1933.
Right.
Okay. So we certainly need that kind of thing. So are people viewing the system at that level of bankruptcy, saying it is so bankrupt that we have to get rid of all the old people who are in office, okay, because they are bought, they are corrupt, they are not useful to us. We have to try something different.
I am hopeful that we're already at that moment. We've had quite a grassroots campaign here. It's really been a 2-year campaign now. The 8 months that I ran and the 16 months since then. And during the first 8 months of that campaign, we had an enormous field operation. And of course, the political consultants were telling me not to put so much money into the field. I'm very glad we did.
Of course you are.
Bernie Sanders, in all of South Florida, had one field office. He had a lot of constraints, and I'm not criticizing his campaign. I'm just mentioning it to contrast. In our campaign for Congress, we had 4 field offices in one congressional district. We had.
I think. Okay, that Bernie, one very big mistake he made was to not try to get the seniors, but with him, okay, because the seniors were simply sitting ducks for the Democrats.
Well, he had the burner supporters, right? I should say, I shouldn't call them the burners. That's circular logic. He had the millennials, the young voters. I think it's very tough with the seniors, and I'll tell you why. You take a look at somebody like Bernie, who has, referred to himself as a socialist. A lot of those seniors, when they hear the word socialism, they have memories. They have memories of the Soviet Union. If you take a generic survey of somebody's view of the word capitalism and the word socialism, if that person is over 60 years old, they're more likely to have a favorability, to view capitalism as favorable and socialism as as unfavorable, and because of the history of the Soviet Union. You ask.
Yes,
folks,
I know the polling very well, but at the same time, okay, I think that Bernie has perfected the perfect answer to this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the way he has always run his campaigns is, I'm a socialist. Here's what I'm for. Do you like it or not?
Right.
Okay, basically that's what he's saying to people. Okay, and they all say, oh, well, that's what I think too.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really care if you're a socialist, as long as you have the same view of what ought to happen, okay, as I do, then I think I can vote for you.
Well,
and that's the way he's won in Vermont. Why wouldn't that work in Florida? Okay, in other words, if he comes down to Florida, okay, and said, hey, I'm for doubling your Social Security payments, and here's how I can do it, and here's how I can pay for it. Why wouldn't he have been able to get involved?
I hear what you're saying, and I think when you lay out the agenda, a social democratic New Deal type of agenda, it resonates with people of all ages. Here in Florida,
I think so too.
Here in Florida, especially among seniors, you have an awful lot of folks who have fled communist regimes. Their view of the world is going to be a bit different than your average senior citizen in the state of Vermont. And
yeah, but you've got a lot of older people in Florida who came from New York.
That's true.
And they're going to have some New Deal perspectives, right?
Absolutely. And all I'm saying is we're better off framing this in the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt.
Yes, I agree.
And even Dwight Eisenhower, I'll tell you. What I find,
I know.
You know, when you read Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address, now what do we remember about Eisenhower's farewell address? He warned about the rise of a
military-industrial complex, right?
Okay, but he also had some interesting things to say about the mixed market. He said that what we need in our society is a balance between the public sector and the private sector. That without sufficient infrastructure investment in the public sector, the private sector won't work well.
And he was a strong supporter of Social Security, too.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a much different, you know, this is in some ways the legacy of several decades now of the politics of triangulation in the Democratic Party.
I couldn't agree more.
When Bill Clinton moved to the right in the 1990s to co-opt Republican issues on welfare reform, on on crime reform, on Wall Street deregulation, on the deregulation of the media, the Republicans didn't just say, well, thank you very much. It drove them further to the right. The entire spectrum shifted to the right.
I know.
And that means Democrats.
But I don't think it started with Bill Clinton, though. Okay, I think that when Jimmy Carter went for the deregulation, okay, of many industries, okay, and when he strove to get a balanced budget during the 1970s, to me, that was really the start of it.
I agree with you on both the balanced budget and on the deregulations. In fact, the first law review articles I ever published were a critique of the deregulation of interest rates, Regulation Q. That started under Jimmy Carter and then intensified under Ronald Reagan. So I'm in complete agreement with you. Something went wrong in the Democratic Party and its commitment to unions, to social justice and equity, and to a mixed market. And it happened in the 1970s.
Yes, it did happen in the 1970s. I think in large part it even goes back to the McGovern campaign, okay, and to the McGovernites.
Yeah.
Okay, because a lot of the McGovernites were, yuppies, basically.
Yes.
And they came from a social milieu which did not have a lot of sympathy for labor, okay, and for, for the unions.
Yes.
In fact, I've known some of those people as they've aged, okay, in recent years. And sometimes I would talk to them about, the unions, okay, and what has happened to the unions. And what I get back from them was stories about the criminal corruption in the unions.
Right.
And how their experiences with unions were so negative.
Exactly. So we have criminal corruption in big corporations, and they're not talking about wiping out corporations. You get criminal corruption in some union leadership, and they want to just undermine the entire labor movement.
Exactly.
Teresa Sanders, one of I just saw come across the screen. she mentions the Powell Manifesto. And I've brought this up in my class, actually. Lewis Powell was a corporate lawyer in the 1970s. And before he was appointed Supreme Court Justice by President Richard Nixon, he drafted a memo for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in which he said, democracy has gone too far. The unions are too strong. Consumer advocates are getting too much power and influence. We have to put an end to this. And he really laid out a blueprint for, you could say, a counterattack, a real counter-revolution by the corporate ruling elites. And
which the Koch brothers have now followed that actually pretty closely for 55 years, right?
Yeah, absolutely. They have. When I was a law professor some years ago back at the University of New Mexico, I became quite aware of what the Koch brothers were trying to do in that state. They were behind efforts to privatize everything from prisons to highways to the school system. So
and they still are.
They still are. This is the libertarian fantasy that there's no government like no government. And you know something? We have a constitution that provides for a government that has some powers to legislate for the general welfare. And to me, it is un-American to be pushing privatizations to these extremes. It's basically saying our Constitution means nothing.
Okay. So let's go back a little to the main question, because there's still something that I want to plumb here. Okay. You have given some hints as to how we might be able to overcome the media, the establishment media. Okay. And those sound like they're pretty sensible and could work. Okay. In other words, it seems to me the antidote but to the media is what was pointed out by sociologists back in the 1930s, okay, and 1940s. Mm-hmm. Okay. And that is on the ground campaigns, person to person influence,
yes.
The friendship group based kind of influence is much more powerful than the mass media, even today.
Exactly. And Joe, okay. we had gotten sidetracked talking about Bernie and socialism. I was in the process of telling you, we had an enormous ground operation here, a field operation, in which hundreds of folks were knocking on, I think at the peak, 10,000 doors a week in the August heat and humidity of South Florida. And they weren't just, leaving literature on the doorknob. They were knocking on the door and having conversations with voters at the doorstep, in their living rooms. These were people of all ages and all races. They had done their homework. They understood the issues. We trained them on the issues. These were true believers in the progressive cause. And they engaged the voters. They would bring back a lot of information. We'd have meetings now and then where I would hear, what are the issues that resonate, that matter to these voters? And it never surprised me. It was jobs and income and healthcare and mass incarceration in many neighborhoods. And that kind of voter engagement is what tipped the scales. About 60 days before my election, we had done a poll that we stopped after a day because it showed me down by like 60 percentage points. Yeah, it's a matter of name recognition. Everyone knew who Wasserman Schultz was. A lot of folks hadn't heard of me. But in the last 60 days, that kind of voter engagement, it didn't matter what the mainstream media was reporting. These folks were having honest conversations in their living rooms and on their doorsteps, and it may have made the difference. It certainly closed the gap in the final days. I think we need to do more of that. And
I think so too.
I'm out here on social media all the time, urging folks to please don't give up on this model of politics, and to please donate to our campaign website at timcanova.com. And it gives us the resources to have that kind of voter engagement and person-to-person education.
Okay, so let me talk about a new threat, okay, that is, we're just actually seeing but come to fruition now. Okay, Facebook, when we first got started, okay, and Twitter, okay, and other social media outlets, the large libertarian plutocratic types of companies now, the Googles, okay, Amazon, okay, they now appear to be extending their tentacles to the point where they are beginning to interfere with our communications to one another, to pick and choose what kinds of messages we are going to see.
Yes.
And to this, of course, we have the influence of the providers also, who are now free to do what they like because of the FCC decision, okay, and Ajit Pai.
Yes.
So this is a new threat, okay, above the mainstream threat. It's sort of an extension of the mainstream threat because now these revolutionary companies, okay, which originally were not part of the mainstream, but which were themselves actually fighting the mainstream, now have joined, apparently, the mainstream consensus.
Yes.
And seem to be devoted to undermining honest conversations that we might have with each other to build political coalitions.
Yes.
So the question is, how do we fight that kind, of new threat, which is coming right into our living rooms?
First of all, let me agree with you wholeheartedly that this is a major threat. The algorithms that are being used and then the sweeping away of net neutrality. I am hopeful that there can be real legal challenges in court to derail the FCC's decision on net neutrality, at least.
I am hopeful too.
Okay. I look at the Democratic Party establishment, and it bothers me to no end. And MSNBC and that liberal media, mainstream media, they have
so-called liberal media.
Exactly.
There's nothing liberal about that goddamn media.
It's the liberal corporate media, right? It's the liberal wing of the corporate media.
It's the so-called liberal corporate media.
They have distracted the American people for a year now away from issues like this that are fundamental to our democracy. And if there's an investigation going on headed by Robert Mueller, fine. But do we have to hear about it 24/7 to the point where we hear nothing else?
And every single night by Rachel Maddow. What the hell has happened to that person?
And at the end of the day, the Mueller investigation might yield next to nothing. Whether it does or doesn't, it is not worth drowning out serious issues such as the end of net neutrality. It is not worth that.
No, it's not.
And they do a disservice to the American people. And look, what MSNBC is going to do, they'll do for their corporate interests. But the Democratic Party, from Chuck Schumer to Nancy Pelosi and everyone in between, should make their own decisions and should be messaging so strongly. We should have, I know I was marching in the streets. Our campaign was joining with the Communication Workers of America. We were protesting outside of Verizon's all over this country.
Yeah,
but
Larry
where
Cohen
was the Democratic Party during that? Okay.
I know where they were. They weren't there.
Yeah, too many of them were doing their call times, you know.
Yes,
and I talked about that during my campaign plenty. 60 Minutes had done an episode of how these incumbent members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans alike, raise money for their campaigns. They go to a call center. They are given lists of wealthy donors, and they spend 30 hours a week dialing for dollars. You know, that is the old politics that are failing us. You know, we need to be able to fund grassroots campaigns through small donations. I agree with you that these algorithms that Facebook and maybe Twitter and others are using, and the end of net neutrality is only going to make it that much more difficult for grassroots campaigns like mine. But, you know, I'm hoping there's still a window open. we need a surge of a year. We need a wave election in 2018, and it can't be enough for Democrats to just to be a Democratic year. It's got to be a year where the center of gravity, the center of power within the Democratic Party moves decisively.
I know. I got an email across my desk today from Schumer, who says, "Only 2 seats to turn. Only 2 seats to turn." And I'm sitting there thinking, "You ass! There are 30 seats to turn, not 2 seats to turn."
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you, man?
Yeah. Well,
you lost your mind. No, I know he hasn't lost his mind. His campaign contributors want 2 seats to turn, and that's it.
Yeah, he's Mr. Wall Street, no doubt about it. And more and more folks are looking at the leadership in the House and Senate, and they're saying they've been around way too long, and they represent the old politics. Look, the challenges ahead are enormous, but this is the time. This is the time right now to stand and fight. We can't afford.
I completely agree. This is the time to stand and fight and to give it everything we have. We have to make a good fight now, because they haven't consolidated the totalitarian state yet. And we have to stop them from consolidating it. We have to stop them from turning it into a fascist state. Mm-hmm. And then we have to stop them from continuing the inverted totalitarian state, because that's exactly what Pence would do.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And if he were impeached also, that's exactly what Ryan would do. And going right down the line, they all would do that. So we have to stop the consolidation in any way we can, through lawsuits, and the person-to-person contacts, that you're talking about, and with whatever financial power we have to support the field operations. The financial power has to go to the field operations, Yes. But, let's say that we are able to capitalize on this moment, and that we are able to have the 1932 kind of wave election but next year.
Yes.
Then what do we try to get through Trump? Mm-hmm. In order to remove these suppressive factors that they have placed on our democracy once again emerging.
Right. Listen, I think we had a wave election in 2008. And
I think we had a wave election there too, but it wasn't enough of a wave election, even so.
The problem, I think, was the Democrats, once they got into power with the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, tried to do too little.
Oh, I agree, but it was because they were corporate Democrats.
Exactly.
It was a wave election, but it wasn't the right kind of wave election.
That's right. And, you take a look at 1933, which you've brought up. And Roosevelt's first 100 days, there were 15 major pieces of legislation passed.
I know, I remember. I shouldn't say I remember. I read about it in history books. I don't remember.
Right.
I'm not that old.
If this is a wave election in 2018, the Democrats need to pass a broad agenda and send bill after bill to Trump's desk and dare him to veto it. If he vetoes it, they become issues in the 2020 election. But it's got to be a very comprehensive agenda. Healthcare for all, Medicare for all. I would say there needs to be major federal support for K-12 and even preschool, and tuition-free higher education. I personally would tie that tuition-free higher education to a national service program. Okay? I think there needs to be tax reform. We need a progressive tax system where the top income tax bracket doesn't start at $450,000 a year.
You're right. And it does not have to do with the pay for notion. It's not about paying for anything.
Exactly.
It's about the threat to democracy.
Exactly. These
taxes have to be levied on people So they have much less financial power to exercise when we get to elections. And we have to make that very clear. It's about our democracy.
I agree with you.
Pay your taxes for that
I agree
reason.
with you completely, Joe. The reason to have a progressive tax system is not to be raising revenue. The reason is that the wealthy have so much money now, so much power. The money translates into power. It's not that they've got enough money to buy another vacation home or another private jet or another yacht. They're able to essentially buy members of Congress, to buy influence.
That's right. It's that they have enough wealth to buy elections.
That's right.
That's the problem.
And then how do they use that political power? It becomes a kleptocracy. You know, the net neutrality, part of it, I think the motivation is to suppress democracy, a good part of it. But a good part of it is also old-fashioned greed. Whatever internet services you have now, they're going to unbundle it and charge you, you know, piecemeal for it, the way your cable bill has all kinds of charges on it.
Exactly.
It's just
exactly. I know. It's just the rent-seeking behavior which they constantly engage in. So, okay.
So I saw a comment, another one from Teresa Sanders. I don't know who she is, but you know,
she's a good one. She's one of ours.
Well, she mentioned the Powell memo, and one of her other comments asked me to stay a little longer for Q&A. So
okay, great.
I'll stay a little longer.
Okay, excellent. Okay, that's great. So, okay. Okay, so let's go right to the Q&A. I think we've covered actually most of the major points of what would have to be done, okay, to fix our democracy. We haven't gotten completely through that because there were some other policies to go through.
Right.
But I think there's a good chance that talking about those things is going to arise when we do the Q&A. Okay, so let's get started with that now so you have a good chance to do that. Okay? Let's see if I can get some of these now. It's down at the bottom of my screen, so often it takes some time to... Okay, Sabrina Geisler says, Garland, you're absolutely right that we should receive our money before the government does. We should receive. I'm not sure that comment is really relevant to what we've been talking about here. Sabrina Geisler says, Andrew Garland, you're absolutely right that we should receive our money before the government does. My grandmother was born in 1913, and she watched as the government started taking taxes out of our paychecks. The citizens didn't agree with it then either. Neither party has been listening to the people for a very long time. Well, I guess we have talked about that sufficiently. But Sabrina is from... the CFAR campaign,
yes.
Victor Tiffany's CFAR campaign.
And I've taken that CFAR pledge, contract for American Renewal. Right.
Yes. And they are working actually closely with us now.
Mm-hmm. Good to hear.
As well. But I think there are some things we favor that go beyond what's in the CFAR campaign. And Casey Callahan asks whether you dig the job guarantee. But Casey Callahan is a Green Party guy from Nebraska.
Well, nice to hear from Casey. I do dig the job guarantee. I've been writing for many years as a scholar for the need for public works. I'd love to. I've been saying for many years that we were overdue for a New Deal. So what does it mean to say something like that? To have a New Deal. A big centerpiece of the New Deal was what was effectively, I think, a jobs guarantee in many ways. During the 1930s, I think the numbers are that 11 million Americans worked in New Deal public works programs. Ronald Reagan's father and his brother got through the Great Depression working for the Works Projects Administration. And the WPA, it didn't just build so much of the infrastructure of this country, and it did build an awful lot of infrastructure, but it employed writers and artists and musicians, you could say cultural production. You had the Civilian Conservation Corps. Right now in our country, there's about 4 million acres of public forests, of federal lands that are being scorched, going up in flames every year now, 4 million acres. And what is our federal policy on that? Essentially, we give subsidies to big timber companies. They say they'll clear the underbrush, and they really don't do much of anything. The CCC during the 1930s put, I think, in total over 3 million young Americans and veterans to work in the great outdoors, getting fresh air, cutting fire lines, putting out small fires before they become big ones, clearing underbrush. And, you know, it was part of the strategy, you could say, to end the Dust Bowl and to end the degradation of the environment. I think we need...
Yes, and that was at a time when our total population was only 130 million or so.
Exactly.
Now we have a population of 325 million.
That's right.
Okay, so the equivalent now would be something like putting
20, 30
8 million people to work on that.
Absolutely. I think we could afford, for sure, to have a sea conservation corps. We could be building sort of a navy of sorts, not for warfare, but to clean up the plastic gyres in the ocean and in our internal waterways. It's an environmental catastrophe that's in the works, and we need to have a plan that puts people to work, giving them dignity and meaning. So I am very much in favor of a jobs guarantee.
Okay, but to be a little more specific about that, though, are you in favor with the MMT version of the jobs guarantee, which is specifies a living wage?
Yes. Yes.
Job guarantee offer and a true living wage offer.
Yes.
Okay. In other words, no monkeying around. There are many of us who favor a cost-adjusted living wage.
Yes.
Okay, that would be much higher, okay, in New York City, okay, than it is in the middle of Kansas, for example.
Well, and the public sector in particular can afford to pay a living wage. You get the argument that there are small businesses on Main Street that can't afford to pay a living wage. And for them, I would say we need subsidies to make sure that they can get the living wage up to the right level. When Obama, in his final year in office, I think he signed an executive order that said essentially any corporation that does business with the federal government has to pay a certain minimum federal wage, right? A certain minimum wage, a federal standard. And it was a pretty meager standard to begin with. And of course, the federal government does something like $3 to $4 trillion of business with the private sector. So that will affect a lot of the private sector. But in many ways, it was just meaningless. It didn't accomplish a lot. I think what would be much more effective is an executive order, or ideally even legislation, that says any company that does business with the U.S. government has to keep the ratio of its top CEO pay to its rank and file to 50 to 1. Because right now it's more like 400 to 1.
Oh, it is. And even the 50 to 1 is excessive compared to other countries.
Completely.
For example, in Japan, the ratio there is something like 30 to 1 or 35 to 1.
And in much of Western Europe, it's about 30 to 1, I believe. So 50 to 1 is being generous to these CEOs as far as I'm concerned. But
right, and I'm not sure we have to be generous. I mean, I think they've already made enough.
Well, I hear you, and I'd like to have far more progressive taxation because a lot of what they're making is a result of federal government supports, whether it's through the Federal Reserve propping up the financial markets or other kinds of corporate welfare. But the point I'm making is if you're raising the federal minimum wage from $7 to $8 at a time when the super rich are just getting massive income gains,
It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. You've
It's
got to
silly.
deal with the distribution.
Yes, you do. And the way to deal with distribution is to have taxation, and at the same time to have a living wage that's a true living wage, okay, across the country. Alan Parker says, nationalize the internet since the American people paid for it.
I just read a great article. I wish I could remember who wrote it. It was entitled something like "The Internet is a Public Utility," and I think it's absolutely right. It needs to be much more strictly regulated. You take a look at the New Deal again, and one of the central features of the early New Deal was public power. It was the Tennessee Valley Authority. It was the Rural Electrification Administration.
It was a wonderful thing in its day.
Absolutely.
It really was.
And we need public power today. If we're going to convert from a fossil fuel to a sustainable, renewable energy environment, we need public power. And the same goes with the internet. I agree. The internet is a public utility, and these are giant corporations that have enormous power, and it affects democracy in such a negative way.
Okay, Teresa Sanders asked, but could you elucidate specific legislation you've thought about that you would like to introduce when you are elected?
Sure. Well, two bills come straight to mind, and they've already been introduced by John Conyers. And, of course, Representative Conyers has had his own scandals. But these two pieces of legislation, one, of course, is H.R. 676, the Medicare for All Act. The other is, I think, H.R. 1000. It's a Jobs for All bill. And some years ago, going back to the 1990s, I worked for a while, and I'm still on the board of the National Jobs for All Coalition, which is based in New York City. I think we need a full employment program. I'm all for that. As a scholar, I've been writing about the Federal Reserve for years. I think the Federal Reserve's governance needs to be reformed. I'd like to see the Federal Reserve use its powers to help Main Street, not just Wall Street. In 2011, I was on, Senator Bernie Sanders appointed me to a special advisory committee on reforming the Federal Reserve, and this was among the discussions that we had. I've also written about another central feature of the New Deal, which was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC. It's been airbrushed from history, but it was essentially a massive national infrastructure bank. Both Bill Clinton in 1992 and Barack Obama in 2008 campaigned for a national infrastructure bank. So many of our competitors have infrastructure banks at the national level: Germany, Japan, China. It is incredible that the United States does not. It is shameful that every time federal, state, or local government wants to engage in infrastructure spending, they've got these fiscal constraints. They've got to borrow on the bond markets. The taxpayer ends up paying twice, once in principal and once in interest. We need an infrastructure bank.
Okay, so speaking of fiscal constraints, then,
yes,
there is a question that I have, okay, for you to answer. Okay, another question. Here is here's a graphic that talks about. Okay, the title of it is "Create Overt Congressional Financing," OCF. And what that is, it's simply two sentences that would be added to every appropriations bill and to every CR bill. Okay, okay, I'll read out the two sentences. Upon passage of this appropriations bill, the Federal Reserve is directed to fill the Treasury spending account at the New York Federal Reserve with the addition to its reserve balance necessary to spend this appropriation. So it's saying to the Federal Reserve, directly on passage, you create the addition to the reserve balance, which is necessary to spend this appropriation. And the second clause is, in addition, The Federal Reserve is directed to fill the Treasury spending account with the additions to the Treasury Reserve balances necessary to repay all outstanding debt instruments, including principal and interest, as they fall due for the fiscal year of this appropriation.
Okay, so let me ask you a little bit about this, Joe. The first sentence, what it reminds me of is the equivalent of having the Treasury issue United States notes in a way that it wouldn't add anything to the deficit.
It would be the functional equivalent, okay, of that.
Yes.
Okay, but this might be easier to get through because it's just a single sentence which is added to the appropriations bill, okay, or the budget bill, okay.
And I've written favorably about the use of greenbacks, of Treasury issuing United States notes as it did during the Civil War, and as the Thomas Amendment to the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 authorized the Treasury as well. So that first sentence seems very compatible. Like you said, the functional equivalent, I certainly don't have a problem with that. The second sentence, my question is this. The Fed essentially would be paying off the debt as it comes due. Does that...
Oh, no, it wouldn't be paying off the debt as it comes due. It would be giving the Treasury.
Right.
It would be increasing the spending account of the Treasury in the amount that was necessary to pay off the debt,
right,
as it fell due, but not any faster than that, just as it fell due.
So my question, and I don't see a problem in the short run. My question is more of a long run, and it's a question, an honest question. Does that lead to a world where we do not have outstanding federal debt instruments?
It leads to a world where we don't have outstanding federal debt instruments. It would take 30 years to get there, but yes.
And is that
and within 6 months, it would be visible to everyone that there is no national debt problem, because with the simple addition of some clauses, you see the debt is getting paid down. And of course, since we're flipping the debt over now very, very frequently, within 6 months, we would be down by, I don't know, $3 billion or $4 billion. It would be transparent to people. Hey, I'm sorry, I didn't. I said billion. I meant 3 or 4 trillion.
Yeah.
Okay. And that, we don't owe 20 trillion anymore now. After 6 months of this, we owe only 16 trillion.
So, again, looking down the road 20, 30 years, a world without any Treasury debt instruments, is that...
Without any Treasury debt instruments, but the Federal Reserve pays interest on reserves, and it can functionally do the same thing as the Treasury debt instruments. It can give the savers a place to put their money where they get essentially the same rate of interest they would have gotten from the Treasury Department.
Well, that sounds okay then. That was my concern, because right now Treasuries serve as, a safe investment for anyone, right?
Right. And in the future, reserves would serve as the same kind of investment.
Reserves,
but to open them up to everyone, reserves at the Federal Reserve. So to open that up to everyone, the Federal Reserve would have to open up the reserve accounts to people, to anyone who wanted to invest at the Federal Reserve.
So let me ask
and it could have a division. It could set up a division for small investors.
That's what I was going to ask.
In order to get this done.
Joe, you could have postal banking like we used to have for decades in this country.
You could.
And
absolutely.
The Federal Reserve could be essentially supplying the reserves for the postal banking system.
Absolutely.
It's interesting. Look, I'm for these kinds of fundamental reforms. I saw coming across the screen while we were speaking, somebody was asking about QE programs for Main Street, quantitative easing for student loans. And I've been writing about this really in the aftermath of the financial crisis, that the Federal Reserve could be doing for Main Street what it was doing for Wall Street. It could be pumping money into state infrastructure banks. It could be buying up student debt to lower the interest rate or even wipe out the debt. And I saw on, I was checking out some of your writings, and you wrote about the platinum coin, the $1 trillion platinum coin. I had been talking about that too during one of the budget sequestration crises.
Yes, but I didn't talk about the $1 trillion coin. I was talking about the $60 trillion coin, okay, which is what I had in mind at that time. But Stephanie Kelton, in one of her, let's say, wilder moments, started talking about the $100 trillion coin. And so I decided, okay, that was a better meme. And so recently I've been talking about the $100 trillion coin also. Okay, I originally specified the $60 trillion coin, okay, because I figured, well, what I'm going to propose is a trial period for 10 to 15 years. Right. And the $60 trillion coin would suffice for the 15 years. Right. Okay, or maybe even as much as, as 25 years. And then if people like the system, they could simply continue it. Right. Okay, but I think the $100 trillion coin actually is more effective as a meme. But okay, the point is, these simple sentences are the functional equivalent of the $100 trillion coin, the greenbacks, right? And I've already the treasury notes.
Yeah, and I've written favorably about that. Joe, these are the kinds of ideas that you want the people's representatives to be talking about.
Right, but not only the people's representatives, I'd like the progressive candidates to be talking about this language. Okay, right. Because if we could get a block of 20 or 30 progressive candidates into Congress, okay, and they stuck together as a cohesive block, they would have enough of a balance of power to probably get this kind of language but through. But because the hook to get this through is ending the debt. After the end the debt campaign of years and years and years being used to hamstring fiscal policy, this end the debt campaign using this language would free up fiscal policy.
Right, right. Yep. Look, you're right that we need a bunch of progressive candidates to be championing this idea. And they've got to be candidates who get elected and don't owe their election to moneyed interests. After getting elected, how do they convert this into legislation? I think what's got to happen is at the level of congressional hearings that educate the American people about the nature of money and debt and what needs to be done. You take a look at Congress years ago, before it was so awash in money, and Congress held hearings, committees and subcommittees, on questions like this. I think there was the Patman hearings of 1962.
Yes.
Now, Congress doesn't really hold hearings except every now and then for, show and tell on, some, for whatever is the media moment of the hour. Because, again, they're busy spending 30 hours a week dialing for dollars. So what I would hope is that we could get Congress to actually hold televised hearings and to be educating the public about the nature of our money problems. I don't think it's going to be enough to just get 30 progressives elected and somehow that balance of power shifts and you're going to get this legislation. I do think this is going to have to be part, we talked about the need for knocking on doors and engaging in voters one-on-one. Well, I think we have to have this kind of public engagement at the level of congressional hearings and televised. Where
okay, maybe so. Okay, but in other words, I'm not certain that it would take 30 or 40 or 50 or 70, okay, or 80. Okay, I'm not sure of the number.
Right.
Okay, but I do think there's a balance of power somewhere where you can use the lever, okay, of ending the debt, and you can pillory people who don't want to put this language in for opposing the end of the debt. You can turn that against them.
Yes.
And that turning that against them, and with the 30 or 40 or 50 people who are with this because they want to free up the situation for fiscal policy, that you can get this passed. Because what reason could they possibly have for voting against this legislation after years and years of agitating for the end of the debt?
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking Paul Ryan here saying he can't support this because the debt is huge. I mean, this takes the argument completely away from him. He can't say that anymore.
Right.
Because the comeback is, well, pass this, buddy. You want to end the debt? Pass this.
So
then what does he say?
Well,
he starts talking about inflation.
Exactly.
And
that's what I was about to say. They're going to say this.
Okay. So whatever. Yeah. Okay. They're going to say that. Okay. But before in history, whenever the issue has been inflation as opposed to jobs, we win that. Yeah. We win that debate. We always won it in the past. We can win it again. We have to get back to that debate.
I agree. And
I'll have that debate any day in the week against them.
Part of the inflation debate. And look, I've written about the 1940s. I published a book chapter in Oxford University Press in which I was praising this hyperactive fiscal policy. People talk about the debt and deficits like they're so terrible. Well, during the 1940s, we had a deficit that was 10 times larger than today as a percentage of GDP, and a national debt that was much larger as well. We had federal spending that was twice as high as a percentage of GDP.
Yes, and we did.
What were the results? The result was a decade of full employment where the unemployment rate actually fell to a low of 1.2%. You had greater, a much more equal distribution of wealth and income. And you had low inflation rates.
Yeah, relatively low inflation rates, right?
So you've got to talk about inflation and the kind of what contributes to inflation. It's not just the money supply. I mean, that's the monetarist, and it's
okay. Yes, and of course, I've considered this also in my book on the platinum coin. There's a chapter devoted to discussion, okay, of inflation, of whether it would cause inflation or not.
Right.
And there is no causal model that the other side has to show a causal chain which would result in inflation if you have this kind of language in every appropriations bill. They have no causal model that can show this.
Right, right.
It's myth. It's pure myth. It's pure legend. It's pure nonsense.
To address inflation problems in our economy, we should be talking about antitrust law. We should be talking about structural reasons for monopolistic pricing, you could say. You take a look at Zephyr Teachout. Are you familiar with Zephyr Teachout?
I'm very familiar with Zephyr Teachout. She's one of my favorite people.
Yeah, same here. Same here. I mean, she's a great scholar who has written a lot about public corruption, but she's also written about the need for a renewed antitrust. So, I agree with what you're saying. And I agree that the boogeyman they will bring up for this will be it's monetizing the debt and it's going to be hyperinflation. So we have to have our ducks in a row and be ready to counter that.
Yeah, so, I have our ducks in a row to counter that, I think.
Right. Well, I'll tell you this, Joe. If and when I'm elected, I will do my best to have you testify at congressional hearings on these two sentences, and I'll be pushing for it.
Wonderful. That's great. Okay, so there's another question which has been in the background of this. And the reason why it's been in the background is that we talk about doing something to regulation, essentially reinstituting regulation, making it effective, okay? And we talk about how important that is, okay? So I think one key question is, how can we reinstate this in such a way that it cannot be subverted again in the same way? In other words, we've just been through an experience where our regulatory agencies aren't working anymore.
Well,
they don't work. How can we stop this from happening again?
This has been a problem that goes back decades. You'll recall Theodore Lowy and the end of liberalism.
Yeah, Ted Lowy actually was my professor in undergraduate school.
Well, that was a classic.
In the honors program at Cornell.
And when did he write The End of Liberalism? 1969, maybe it was published? The first
something like that, right. Okay. Yeah, something like that. 69, okay, or the early 70s.
Right. And
yes.
and
yes.
what
I didn't like that book very much.
It's a tough book to read. I had to read it as a political science student. But the point is,
yeah, but that's not why I didn't like it.
Why didn't you like it?
Well, I didn't like it because it's in some ways it's a foundational text for the politics of neoliberalism.
In what way? Okay. I thought he was describing the capture of agencies through iron triangles and revolving doors.
Yes, he was describing that. Okay, and that part of the book was very good. Okay, but his views of the end of ideology,
yeah,
okay, and such are views that are antithetical to things like the Sanders movement, okay, right. For example, now, okay, and it led to the form of interest group liberalism, or to an accentuation of that kind of of liberalism.
But Joe, and I don't mean to get into a pedantic discussion. I saw him as giving a critique of interest group pluralism. And part of his critique was very similar to a legal scholar at the time, my old friend, the late John Hart Ely, in his book, Democracy and Distrust. They talk about the way Congress would legislate, very broad delegations of authority being delegated to bureaucratic agencies that then, because they were such broad delegations, those agencies had a lot of leeway and they would be captured by special interest groups. So it becomes a delegation problem. You can look at the Federal Reserve as a unique sort of private delegation, a delegation.
Yes, I do see that. Yeah.
Right. But
I think that part of the analysis was very good.
Right. And that's why I brought it up. What we have is a problem where agencies are captured on a regular basis. And it's gotten a lot worse since Lowy's day, because it's no longer just the Environmental Protection Agency. It's now even the Department of Justice. We don't, when no bankers get prosecuted, well, why is that? It's agency capture. It's the Justice Department, the Attorney General and the head of his criminal division going through the revolving door and becoming, partners making millions of dollars a year at huge law firms representing the same bankers. So this revolving door is a big part of the problem.
Oh, yes, I agree. So you would stop the revolving door.
We've got to do a lot more to stop the revolving door. And, I wrote about it in 1999 when Robert Rubin went through the revolving door. He went from Treasury Secretary to one of the 3 top people at Citigroup, and at the same time lobbied for the end of the Glass-Steagall Act, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. It was such a blatant conflict of interest. I was calling for the Justice Department to investigate that, and that was 1999.
Yes, 1999, okay. And Larry Summers, of course, has been through the revolving door, okay, a number of times. And had Hillary Clinton won, he would have gone through the revolving door again.
Yeah, I don't doubt it.
He would have been in the Clinton administration.
Remember when Obama was considering appointing him as Federal Reserve Chairman?
I do remember. Yeah. Yes, I do remember.
Spoke out against that as well.
Also, I remember Gene Sperling, okay, and Jack Lew. Have been through a number of times, okay, as well.
Yep.
And all basically poisonous appointments.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay, so that's one way, okay, but still, there's going to be a lot of money in back of continuing to subvert the regulatory agencies. And I guess this gets really to the crux of our problem, which in one sense we haven't really gotten to yet. Okay, and that gets back to the iron law, okay, of oligarchy. Okay. how do you overthrow the iron law? If we want to set up a democracy that isn't going to be vulnerable to the iron law, we have to have the same kind of continuous bottom-up activity. Well, we have to have continuous bottom-up forms of activity going on all the time to counter the continuous attempts at influence that are coming from the elite in society, because there will always be elites. We can't do anything about that.
And I agree with the continuous bottom-up orientation. I do. I don't think that's enough. You know, you take a look at what Keynes was writing. I think it was before the Great Depression. What he was writing about the publicly held corporation, that these publicly held corporations are essentially public institutions. I know they're privately owned, but they're invested in all kinds of public power. They're chartered by the state. And yet there's no representation of society's diverse interests on the corporate board of directors. And I think that's where we need to go. You take a look at what Germany and Sweden and Denmark and I think Holland and a bunch of other continental European countries have done. And they've got labor representation on the boards of directors. And
you're right. And I know that's been effective to some degree, but it hasn't been completely effective. When I say continuous bottom-up activity, I'm thinking of a situation where we have much more large-scale day-to-day participation in politics by many, many more people than we have now. Basically, ordinary people contending for social power and for political power, in various ways. And people who, to some degree, are supported in these pursuits by federal programs, like the Job Guarantee Program, or the Basic Income Program. Now, while a lot of MMT people are for having a basic income, it's not a universal basic income. It's a basic income for people who are not able to work or who do not want to work. And it's at a lower rate than the job guarantee living wage would be. So it's not the same as the universal basic income. That's nonsense in so many ways. I don't even want to talk about it. But in other words, there would be provisions within the social safety net which would work to support continuous, more active participation in politics by the citizenry. In other words, there would be a recognition by the government and in society that civic participation is too important to leave to the amateurs. We've got to have people who are professionals in this area and who are supported because they are professionals in this area, because they choose to work in this area and they choose to sacrifice and to serve in this area. That's the only way we're going to get a permanent counter to the influence of the elites. It's the only way we're going to repeal the iron law, of oligarchy.
You know, you might be right. I'll tell you, I'm not a wealthy guy. I'm a lawyer.
And neither am I.
Yeah. And it's been a big sacrifice to run twice in a row now. And
I'm sure.
My income has taken a hit as a result. And yet I'm fortunate enough that I'm a tenured law professor. I've been able to hang in there. Most people, I think, would not be able to. It shouldn't have to be that hard for somebody to decide they want to run for an office like this. And at any kind of level, whether it's a school board or up to Congress or something. So the spirit of what you're saying, I'm completely in agreement with. As it is now, I think most of those who do run for Congress, they're either employed by or subsidized by major law firms and lobbyists in one way or another. And that's I think, part of the crux of the problem. I've been hopeful that, again, social media helps at least to raise the money to run for office. I can't raise money to pay my personal expenses and bills. I just got to tighten my belt for that kind of stuff.
Okay, so I'd like to post a question now from Tricia Roberts. Tim, what can we do about the apartheid state of Israel? Do you subscribe to the BDS campaign?
I don't. I'm not a supporter of BDS, but neither do I think it should be criminalized. I've lived and worked in Israel, and I've been there a number of times. Going back to the resolution equating Zionism with racism, I didn't agree with that, and that was a lot of years ago. I don't think the Israelis are trying to keep Palestinians down because of their race. I don't think this is a racial issue. I think it is, in many ways, from the Israeli perspective, a security issue more than anything else for the average Israeli worried about violence. By the same token, I believe strongly there needs to be a two-state solution, but I don't think it's going to just happen magically by wishing it. I think you need a real regional type of an approach here. And the United States has not been engaged in trying for a regional approach for an awfully long time. My problem with the Iran agreement was that it was done out of a broader context. Take a look at BDS. People are upset because American tax dollars go to support the state of Israel. And we're talking about a few $1 billion a year, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Something of that magnitude. And yet our spending power as consumers is overwhelmingly going to regimes like the Saudi regime. So when you talk about arms sales in the region, Israel gets the support of $1 billion or $2 billion from the United States taxpayer. And the Saudis enter into a $100 billion arms purchase agreement, first with the Obama administration, and then another $100 billion with the Trump administration. And where's Saudi Arabia getting that money from? They're getting it from every time we go to the pump and we're gassing up. So, I don't think it's going to be effective to just demonize Israel. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a supporter of the worst parts of this occupation. I'd like the occupation to end. I have lost loved ones in Israel. This is a conflict that's been going on too long. But I don't think BDS is the solution. I really think the United States and other major powers of the world need to sit down and have regional and global arms control and disarmament conferences. In our lifetime, it used to be what? Arms control with the Soviet Union over intercontinental ballistic missiles. The problem now goes beyond weapons of mass destruction to all kinds of war materials that are flowing not just to the Israelis, but to the Saudi Arabia, Iran. The whole region is awash, not just in arms, but in unemployed and underemployed young men who are being hired sort of as mercenaries. So it becomes a whack-a-mole where we destroy Al-Qaeda and it comes back as ISIS. So, I understand the criticism and the frustration with Israel, but I think a solution has to go way beyond just singling out Israel. We really need a multilateral solution in that region.
Yes, I agree. We need a multilateral solution there also. But what is hard to get the people off of is the idea, but correct to a large degree, that the Israeli state took a wrong turn after the victory in 1973.
Well, some would say even after 67.
Yeah, some would say even after 67. That's right.
Yeah.
When they began to support the settlements in the occupied areas.
Yes.
That was something that arose out of Israeli internal politics, and that has done a tremendous amount to ruin the prospects for peace. And so there's considerable blame on the Israelis for what's happened over the last, what is it now, 40 years? Okay, more than about 40 years. So it's not hard to understand why people seeing the victimization of the Palestinians in this particular situation, but say a plague on the house of Israel.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not hard to understand that. I'm sure I would have very strong feelings in that particular direction. Okay, except for the fact that I have relatives there too.
Right.
Okay, and
for full disclosure, Joe, I'll say I grew up in a neighborhood on Long Island that was a very Jewish neighborhood. I went to a high school where it was mixed, but a very Jewish population as well. My father died when I was a child, and my stepdad for many years now is Jewish. I wouldn't call him a devout Jew at all. And when I decided in my early 20s to go to the Middle East to work on a kibbutz and travel around, both my parents, my mom and stepdad, were alarmed and afraid, and were not encouraging me to go at the time. I lived on a kibbutz in northern Israel, north of Haifa, for several months, working. Do
you know the name of the kibbutz?
Yes, Kibbutz Kfar Masaryk, named after Tom Masaryk, old Czech leader.
Okay, yeah.
That kibbutz was a left.
Thomas Masaryk.
Yeah, it was a left-wing kibbutz. It was a peace now kibbutz. Okay, it did not favor settlements. It was peace now. And after Oslo, the Oslo Accords, folks from my kibbutz, who I was good friends with, were going down to Gaza and working with the Palestinians and sharing irrigation technology and helping them with their agriculture. The Intifada changed all that. 2 intifadas changed that. And that's why I say, from the Israeli perspective, it's a security issue. And I know a lot of Democrats and a lot of progressives don't want a long conversation about it. But I got to say, I look at what's happened to that kibbutz, and it has shifted significantly to the right, and it's a result of violence. One of probably my best friend on the kibbutz was killed doing his Miluim by a suicide bomber. And that was in 2002 when Tamir was killed. The violence breeds violence. And Martin Luther King used to talk about this, the cycle of violence. The cycle of violence has to end. I read in the papers just in the last few days that the Israelis now say that mortars have been shipped from Iran to Hamas in Gaza. So you get charges and countercharges. And the daily life of Palestinians on the West Bank is a very tough life. Believe me, I'm well aware of it. They've got all kinds of problems that need to be addressed. And I'm not just going to get and pander and say, yes, I'm for BDS because that's what a lot of my supporters are for. I do think that BDS alone is not going to solve the problem. I am not a Netanyahu fan. I have been a critic of Likud for many years, and it's not just the settlement policy. It's been its own social and economic policies as well that have made Israel a more divided society as well. So the cycle of violence has to end. I don't see how you end it just by cutting off support for Israel. You really need to have a comprehensive global solution. There are a dozen countries around the world that are major arms manufacturers, and the United States leads them all. And what's been horrifying in our lifetime is sort of this lack of humanity that's going on, where we find ourselves arming almost every side of every war in the Middle East now. And it's just got to come to an end already.
Okay, so I think that people who are listening to us, would probably like to know, and this is a tough question, when you get elected to the Congress, what do you think that you can do to ease this particular situation?
I think I'll say this, that the district I'm running in has the highest number of Holocaust survivors of any district in the country. And we need to facilitate discussion about this, and a two-way discussion. I understand the critique of Israel, and people say, well, we had sanctions against South Africa and it brought change there. And it did, but South Africa, I don't think, was surrounded by a lot of countries that were refusing to make peace with it. We have to be very realistic about this. This has been going on. It is a very tough issue. It's been going on for decades. Egypt has entered into peace with Israel, and they've been generally a decent partner. Jordan as well. But take a look at Israel, the rest of Israel's neighbors. You know, these are rather repressive regimes that I think the leaders have an interest in perpetuating the conflict with Israel. And I don't mean to be Pollyannish or flippant about it. The world needs not just Israeli society, but its neighbors need a much different orientation away from military solutions and towards policies that are good for the people. Most of Israel's neighbors are countries that are marked by widespread unemployment and underemployment and harsh regimes that are very military in orientation, and they're not democratic in any way. You know, I would be trying as a member of Congress to be discussing this and not just taking knee-jerk positions.
Have you any impression for how many other members of Congress have a similar kind of orientation towards this?
I don't. I'm not sure. I'm not. Here in South Florida, the politics might be a little bit like they are in New York in this regard. Yes. But, I haven't pandered and said that we should be outlawing BDS. But by the same token, I don't find BDS to be an effective solution.
Okay, so to switch the subject now, Richard Gammon asks, Tim, are you going to bring up the Awan Brothers scandal during your campaign and the fact that the DWS threatened the head of the police force?
I have brought it up quite a bit, especially at the time that it happened. I haven't been messaging on it much lately, mostly because, like a lot of folks, I'm waiting to see whether the official investigations lead to anywhere. I think probably many of your viewers are aware of the scandal that Wasserman Schultz, her top IT aide, a fellow named Imran Awan, I think of Pakistani origin,
yes,
has been arrested or indicted for bank fraud, but being investigated for all kinds of cyber crimes. There's lots of theories about what's been going on. Apparently, he had access to a couple of dozen congressional Democrats' private emails and files, and accessed them even from Pakistan when he was there. He was arrested trying to flee the country for Pakistan. His wife had already left for Pakistan and returned. And Wasserman Schultz did not fire him as an IT aide until he was actually arrested, even though months before every other member of Congress had fired him as an IT aide. And then again, there was that memorable scene where she was threatening the head of the U.S. Capitol Police, demanding to have some laptop returned to her. With Wasserman Schultz, she's sort of the gift that keeps on giving. She's always mired in some kind of scandal, and you don't know where the corruption truly ends and where it begins. My guess is these issues might come back. The Republicans are running 3 different candidates right now in this district, and one of them in his kickoff announcement really put Wasserman Schultz's scandals in the crosshairs. So there might be some Republican money coming into the district that will do that kind of work for us. I will say that while I made it a big issue for some months, after it finally got the attention of Congress and maybe the Justice Department, and investigations began, I've really instead decided in better use of our time is to talk about the issues that matter to people in their everyday lives right now.
Okay, so here's an issue that's brought up by Devin Jones, and he asks, by Mr. Canova, is housing a human right?
I think it should be. I take a look at Franklin Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights and as a great blueprint, and he talked about the right of every American to have a decent job and a decent income, health care, an education, access to a good education, and housing. And I do think it should be seen as a right. We have far too many homeless in this country. A lot of them are veterans, but not all of them are veterans. Here in South Florida, because it's a warm environment, you get a lot of people who end up sleeping on the streets and they get pushed around. In Fort Lauderdale, they try to criminalize even the feeding of homeless folks. This is outrageous. You know, the population, the demographic between 18 and 34 years old are more likely to be living at home with their parents now than to be living on their own, starting families of their own. The cost of housing is getting out of control in so many parts of this country. And I think the solution really is public housing again. Public housing was given a bad name because we underinvested in it. It deteriorated as a result. But we should be putting people to work to build affordable housing. And the cost of housing in inner cities, in the core parts of cities, has become astronomical. You see it in New York, Washington, Miami, San Francisco, Boston, so many cities around the country where, somebody on a six-figure income can't even afford to live there. It used to be just that, service workers like janitors, for instance, and police officers and teachers couldn't afford to live in these cities, and they would have long commutes. And now it's becoming even more widespread. So I do think it needs to be a huge priority of ours.
Okay, so Molly Scarborough asks, do you have an address or a P.O. box to mail donations to?
Yes.
Not everybody wants their info on the internet.
Yes. Let me pull that up right now. Those who want to contribute through the internet can simply go to timcanova.com and contribute online. But we certainly welcome checks, and you could send a check to P.O. Box 22-1868, Hollywood, Florida 33022. That's P.O. Box 22-1868, Hollywood, Florida 33022. Thank you. I appreciate that. Our campaign needs all the help we can get. Those who can give whatever it is. Our average donation last year during the campaign was $17. And 209,000 times somebody clicked on their computer to donate $17 on average. And,
wow.
Yeah, it was. We broke all kinds of records for the highest percentage of small donations ever given to a campaign for either the House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, or the President of the United States. The highest percentage. I didn't do a single moment of call time. I didn't call anyone up and ask for a penny, but we did send, and we do send emails regularly asking for money. I proudly say over and over again that I am bought and paid for by the American people.
Okay, great. So, but Casey Callahan asks, but a permanent job guarantee administered at the local level, Tim?
Well, I talk about a federal job guarantee, like a public federal financing, a new deal.
Yes, right. I think that Casey means a federal job guarantee, but also in the sense that it's funded by the federal government, but
administered locally. I'll tell you one idea that I've brought up many times, and I strongly support it. You can go back to 1960s presidential debates between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. And Kennedy was calling for the federal government to subsidize local school teacher salaries. And the argument he made was decades ahead of his time. It still resonates today, that without federal support for local school teacher salaries, our teachers will be woefully underpaid, and there'll be great disparities in the quality of education between wealthy districts and poor districts. And Richard Nixon did not wholly disagree with him. He said the federal government should be subsidizing local school districts for brick and mortar for construction costs, but not for teacher salaries. I think if the federal government were to have significant subsidies for local school teacher salaries, make it a profession where a lot of folks could go into and actually raise a family on that income, it would go a long way, and actually at the same time allow us to reduce the class sizes and the teaching load significantly. You know, what bothers me is that as a professor at a law school, I compare my teaching with those of K-12 public school teachers. They are in the classroom more in each day than I am in a week, and I'm probably paid 3 times as much as most of them, maybe 4 times as much as many of them. And that is not valuing public education. So, you know, when you talk about a federal jobs guarantee that's implemented at the state and local level, well, federal subsidies for school teacher salaries would go a long way. In the immediate aftermath of the 2008 financial collapse, I'm talking about in 2009 and 2010, I believe the numbers I saw were that nationwide 700,000 school teachers lost.
Yes, I saw that number also.
Yeah, shameful.
Yeah, and of course, the same was true for other public functionaries.
Police, firefighters.
As well.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yep.
Right. They lost jobs because very little tax revenue was flowing into the local governments and state governments.
Where I am in South Florida, in my school district, in Broward County and in Miami-Dade, we've got lots of schools that are suffering with mold in the classrooms, mold and mildew. I'm shocked. I went to public schools K-12 in New York, and I went to a great public school. I got a great public education. I think every American should be able to get a great public education. The teachers should be well compensated, and the schools should be free of mold, mildew, and other kinds of diseases.
Yeah, yes, I say the same. The public school I went to, the first school was fine. Okay, it was excellent. I went to a junior high school that was great. I went to a high school that was terrific. And I had no problem in getting into a good college. And, okay, I got a great education. And that was in New York City at that time.
Right.
I don't think that is any longer available to the same extent, okay, as it was then in the public schools. Okay.
You know, while money can't solve all of our problems, I get it, but money can solve an awful lot of them. And we have, for a generation now, maybe 2 generations, we have misallocated our resources badly. I take a look at the public schools, and I think perhaps this is intentional. Destroy the public school system so they can be privatized. Everything becomes a profit opportunity, unfortunately, when you let the
and also it also has the incidental result, okay, that but people who go to these schools don't learn anything about history. They have no exposure to the New Deal.
Yep.
But they have no exposure to the radical movements, okay, in American history. They have no idea about the heritage.
I'm glad you brought it up.
They have.
Yeah, Joe, I'm glad you brought that up. I spoke to a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, who's got two children who just graduated from decent public schools, and their social studies, civics, history, concentrated mostly on post-Civil War Reconstruction. And she said that's because they teach to the test. And that's where the test is. The test is not for late 20th century American history. So folks are not even learning the context of our own present political moment. Okay.
And one of our people, a Mr. Bishop, says the Mondragon worker-owned companies only allow 3 times to 9 times differential between the lowest and the highest paid employee.
Yeah.
And this probably comes from Rick Wolf.
Yeah.
Okay, and the things that he's been saying, okay, of late, and of course, all those things are correct. Okay,
Absolutely.
that is what goes on in. So, I think the more general question is, what would you do to foster the cooperative movement here in America?
So I think when we look at cooperatives and we look at small businesses and family-owned businesses, they have a very difficult time getting access to credit. And this is what I've written about as a scholar. When you take a look at the Federal Reserve during the 1930s and 40s, they actually made loans directly through the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks to Main Street businesses. Congress authorized a program. They authorized up to $280 million in loans. And you're talking about 1933, I think, when this was authorized.
Yes,
that was a lot of
money.
Yeah. And I'd like to see the Fed do the same thing. And that was one of the proposals that I was making when I was on Bernie Sanders' advisory committee on reforming the Federal Reserve. I think the Fed should be pushing money into Main Street businesses, cooperatives, infrastructure banks. It should be doing a lot more for Main Street rather than just buying trillions of dollars in mortgage-backed securities from Wall Street firms.
Okay, so what Andrew Garland asks is, he says, raising the minimum wage simply kicks the can down the road. Our issue is the neoliberalism.
Well,
yes, that is our issue. How would you address that?
Well, I think we, in some ways, already did address it. I think it's not going to be effective to raise minimum wages
I think so too.
If you're not concentrating on the maximum wages, so to speak, on the high end. There's a book, you've probably heard of it or even read it, by Thomas Frank called Listen Liberal.
Yes.
And in that, he lays out some of the numbers since the financial crisis. From 1940 to 1980, 70% of the income gains went to the bottom 90%. It essentially went to middle America. Since the financial crisis, 90% of the income gains, 100% of the income gains have gone to the top 10%, and 90% have gone to the top 1%. So you could try raising the minimum wage, but if the cost of housing and healthcare and food are going up so dramatically, it's not going to make a difference.
Okay, just a point though. With respect to the MMT job guarantee proposal, that establishes a living wage for people in that the job guarantee program.
Right.
Okay, so the point is that would become the de facto minimum wage for the nation.
So this is necessary but not sufficient, is what I'm saying.
Right. Okay, and I agree it is not a sufficient thing, but it's also serves as an anchor.
Yes.
Once it's established, okay, at the start there would be an upward price adjustment. Okay, because obviously if the wage was $18 an hour on the average across the country, there would be then lots and lots of businesses which would have to raise wages up to that level.
Right.
But once the level is established, okay, it would not be indexed to inflation on a continuing basis. So after the first adjustment, it would serve as an anchor.
Absolutely. And then you have an automatic adjustment. Yeah.
Right, and would contain inflation, okay, as opposed to being a force for it. So, okay, but to address the neoliberal question, we have addressed, I think, okay, the neoliberalism question, okay, in many ways here tonight, because we've been talking about, first of all, a very heavy taxation, okay, of the wealthy corporations and the rich, okay, and we've also obviously been talking about legislation for public purpose and damn the market. The essence, okay, of neoliberalism is that but the market governs everything. Everything takes a back seat to the market. That's the heart of the ideology, okay, of neoliberalism, and it's the heart of its practice also. It's about try to privatize everything,
Right.
okay? What we've talked about here tonight is the opposite of that.
Exactly. And you know, in the 1990s, as a law professor, as a legal scholar, I was publishing articles and book chapters about this. You know, and neoliberalism, what is the policy agenda of neoliberalism? A lot of folks would say it's the Washington Wall Street consensus. So what was that Washington consensus? It's fiscal austerity, privatization, deregulation, the liberalization of trade, and the liberalization of finance. All of those have to be addressed. And I agree. We've discussed a lot of that tonight.
Yes, we have discussed a lot about that. And by the way, just to put in a commercial for myself, a lot of that is discussed in my books also. Mm-hmm. So if you want to learn that, well, you might want to go to those as well. Andrew Garland says, my point is you've got small business that isn't able to pay for that. And Tim has addressed that already. He says that small businesses that serve the public purpose would be subsidized, so that they would be able to pay for it. Yeah. Okay, and businesses, I would go further and say, in businesses that are not serving a public purpose, okay, but only a pure private purpose, mm-hmm. do not deserve to be able to exploit their workers by paying less than a living wage. Mm-hmm. So they would have to sink or swim in the new environment. And so that, again, is a point that we're making, which is not at all neoliberalism.
Yeah. And Joe, you know, I'd like to say a few words about the nature of what's happening here in South Florida.
Go ahead.
You know, South Florida is really on the front lines of climate change. We've got rising sea levels, and we see flooding of coastal communities on a regular basis now. We've got saltwater intrusion of the aquifer as a result of the rising sea levels. If there's anywhere in the country that should be converting from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources like solar and wind, it's here in South Florida. We need to be leading the country in that regard. And that's been a big part of our campaign as well. And that's why I've supported the OFF Act that was introduced by Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. When I talk about the need for a national infrastructure bank, it would help make the kinds of investments we need to get a new electricity grid, to get solar and wind energy in the Sunshine State and all across the country. Another major issue that we see here in South Florida is the need for greater racial equality and racial justice. We've got, I think, the highest percentage and number of private prisons in the country in the state of Florida. The drug war has been an absolute disaster. It's been enforced in a racially discriminatory fashion all over the country. And there's great inequalities here in South Florida between groups, racial and ethnic groups. So certainly a full employment program helps achieve greater justice, you could say, it's social justice and racial justice. But we've got to go beyond full employment. We've got to have a real end to this war on drugs and mass incarceration. My opponent takes money from private prison companies. And of course, I don't take any. She has supported a private immigration detention center right here in our own district. You know,
right, and she also takes a lot of money from the pharmaceutical companies.
Pharmaceutical companies, payday lenders, the Wall Street banks that finance the payday lenders. You know, you cannot find a congressional race with as great a difference between a people's candidate, a grassroots progressive candidate, and on one side, and on the other side, a corporate-dominated liberal. But she's not progressive in any way. You know, and when I say liberal, look, she's liberal on some issues.
Yes, on some of the social issues, yes. She's liberal.
I applaud her on women's rights, on rights of gay and lesbian brothers and sisters, things like that. But you know, when you're for a drug war, when you're for mass incarceration, essentially, when you're silent on those issues, you're not much of a liberal.
And you're not much of a liberal either when you're not someone who would support a Green New Deal.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, how can someone be a liberal and not be a supporter of the successor to the New Deal? How can someone be a liberal and not actually recognize the Second Bill of Rights?
Right.
The answer to that question is that's no kind of liberal that I know about.
That's right. And
no kind of liberal at all.
I've been advocating for a New Deal for so many years.
Me too.
And I mean, in written form, I've got a written record, a published record of this, and it really goes back to the 1980s and 1990s. And I used to say, really during the George Bush administration, that we were overdue for a New Deal. And then we get a financial crisis like none we've seen since the Great Depression. We are so overdue for a New Deal, and so many of our problems that we're facing as a nation and that are being faced overseas are because of years and years and decades of neglect of people. And there's so much corporate profit and there's so much money that's flowed to the top 0.1%, trillions of dollars being held offshore, that there's just no justification for it anymore. So, I know we talked for a while about the difficulties in the Middle East, and, this is a part of the world where people are suffering and where there's not economic opportunities. And I really think that a New Deal is needed, not just in this country, but it's got to be global at this point if democracy.
I think so too.
You're going to survive.
I think so too, because if we're going to defeat neoliberalism, that has to be a global defeat.
Absolutely.
Because they're a global movement and an ideology that is global, and they are anti-democratic.
Yeah.
They are the new foes of democracy.
Yes.
And we need to defeat them wherever they are, not just here in the United States. Of course, for us, we need to do what we need to do to defeat them here in the United States. So Dave Strider asks, Dave Strider is running for the Senate in the state of Washington. He's a Democrat, and he's running against Cantwell, this year. And he says, use the same energy in applying green power as we did to defeat the Nazis, meaning 5 years, we have 85 to 100% all residential and small business actually using the green power. That was his statement.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with him more, and I applaud him for that statement. I would recommend that he gets in touch with people at Climate Mobilization. Climate Mobilization endorsed me. They want a World War II type of a mobilization. I've written about this as a scholar, mobilizing financial resources to pay for a New Deal. It can't just be mobilizing people to work. You've got to mobilize the financial resources to make it happen. And of course, that's very consistent with MMT as well. I find it problematic when we set these goals that in 20 or 30 or 40 years, we want to accomplish some goal. That's not what made this country great in the past. We won World War II by mobilizing now. And we made it to the moon in a decade because it wasn't a goal to happen in 40 or 50 years. President Kennedy said he wanted to happen in a decade. We have to have plans, like a 5-year plan and at the most a 10-year plan. Beyond that.
We have to have that now because we needed control of fossil fuels 30, 40 years ago.
Right.
We had some initiatives in the Carter administration. Nothing since. Nothing. One of the worst things to happen to America was the election of Ronald Reagan, in 1980.
And the first thing he did was take those solar panels off the roof of the White House. I know.
You bet.
Yep.
Yeah, he didn't take the solar panels off the roof of my house.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And you take the conflict, the endless conflict in the Middle East. Syria, we've got a battle of oil pipeline programs where the West wants one pipeline and the Syrians want a different pipeline. And is that what we're really going to war over?
Not me. I'm not going to war over that. I doubt there are many people who are looking on here today who are going over that. Have you ever talked to Michael Hexter?
No, I don't. I don't know who he is.
Okay, he's a fellow at the Gonzaga Institute, and he's a blogger. Okay, at NEP also from time to time. Okay, the UMKC site.
Right.
Okay, and he's proposed a $4 to $6 trillion a year plan in order to address the climate crisis. He wrote that up in 2014. Okay, today he is a little more tame in what he proposes, but I don't think because he's changed any of the views he has. I think it's because he's looking to do something which but can be done politically. But anyway, you might want to look up a video he and I did. I think it was perhaps 3 weeks ago here, 3 to 4 weeks ago.
Michael Hexter.
Yes, Hoexter.
Okay.
We had a pretty long conversation on the climate climate crisis and its views on that crisis. And also, in addition, about 4 weeks before that, we had an earlier discussion which dealt with his $4 to $6 trillion a year plan.
Okay.
Okay, and actually the political barriers that were facing that plan.
Okay.
Okay, so both interviews I think are of interest.
Thank you for that homework.
Sure. Okay, so I'm looking for some other things we have not covered. So Catherine Klaas says, but donate to Joe and Tim because both are true leaders. And what I have to say to that is thank you very much, Catherine, but because I'm well aware that you have donated to me. Okay, I don't know whether Tim has you on his list as yet, but thank you very, very much for the donation.
Yeah, thank you for the shout out. Appreciate it.
Okay, so Mark Collins says, upon passage of appropriate, he is just quoting from my language, so I don't see a question here about it. So I guess we've covered that.
Someone asked, I just saw if I support Medicare for all. I do. I have from the very beginning. I've been supporting that kind of solution for decades.
You're right. And you mentioned H.R. 676 earlier, which is the Medicare for All bill. Okay, I do have a question to ask you, okay, with respect to that. Okay, that bill is something that is a deficit neutral bill. It's fully paid for in the Conyers formulation. Under the new language that I specified here, that is overt congressional financing,
right?
It would not necessarily be the case that H.R. 676 would then have to be a deficit neutral bill.
Right.
And the reason for that is that once this language gets into the appropriations bills, it deals with the funding in the appropriations bills, but then the taxing bills are done separately for the whole budget.
Right.
And these then would be key to the deficits we need. In other words, the deficits that are healthy deficits for the United States, basically full employment deficits.
Right.
We don't have those kinds of deficits now.
That's right.
We have deficits that are far too small. And we likely, in my calculation, we have policy space that's left in the deficit of something like $2 trillion.
Right.
But today,
right,
that we could be spending that we are not spending. And that if we were spending, we would have a full employment economy and one that could probably address the climate change too. So I didn't want to introduce that.
So let me ask you a question. Did you, by any chance, ever read or know an economist named Lynn Turgeon?
No, I never had the pleasure.
He was an economist at Hofstra University. He had been a Sovietologist who, near the end of his career, after the fall of communism, kind of returned to his Keynesian roots. And he and I wrote a number of book chapters and articles together. He wrote a book in 1996. It was published called Bastard Keynesianism, which was a term that came from Joan Robinson. And what's a bastard Keynesian? It's essentially the commercial Keynesians or the military Keynesians, but it's not the kind of Keynesians who would have a New Deal. And Turgeon used to write about the difference between active deficits and passive deficits, and that a lot of our deficits are the result of underspending, actually.
Yes.
Slow growth economy.
Yes, he is right, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, he was right. I assume that he still is writing, correct?
No, Lynn passed away, I believe, in 1999. He was a very close friend of mine. He was in his late 70s when he passed, but he was a wonderful thinker. He used to talk a lot about the grants economy, Kenneth Boulding. And
yes, Kenneth Boulding. I knew him slightly during the 1960s.
Well, you take a look at the GI Bill of Rights and the Marshall Plan, and what's the narrative that the orthodox narrative today is you can't spend on foreign aid because we're going to lose money. You can't spend on a GI Bill or a New Deal because it's going to cost money.
Oh,
and Boulding's point was that it actually brings in more money in the long run. For every dollar spent on the GI Bill of Rights, there was like $3 of economic growth and $2 of tax revenue coming in from the resources that were then employed over the lifetime of those individuals. And
yes,
that's the way we need to be looking at a New Deal and foreign aid, that those types of investments pay for themselves several times over.
I completely agree. I couldn't agree more. I've always felt that way. I mean, I've felt that way certainly since the 1950s and 1960s, and I never had occasion to change my views over that period of time. Okay, about investments in people actually paying themselves back, right? Many times over. Teresa Sanders says, "I hope Tim will also think about food labeling, so we know what is in processed and fast foods." So people can make informed choices, but beyond fresh produce and a few other products.
I'm already on board. I'm a big believer in that. Organic labeling. Unfortunately, during the Obama administration, we saw too many appointments to the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drug Administration coming from the Monsantos and the Cargills and the big corporations that don't want food labeling. So I'm right on board with Teresa Sanders again. There's a problem here, Joe. I keep agreeing with everything you're saying and a lot of your viewers.
Well, I'm not sure that's really a problem, Tim.
Not really a problem.
Okay, so we've been at this now for nearly about 2.5 hours.
Yeah. And
we still have 71 people here, and for most of this, we were up over 90, okay, or up over 100, or up over 120. So it was a very, very good broadcast. But our people have been very patient, and they have hung in there for the most part.
Well, I appreciate you having me on, Joe. I mentioned I'm just getting over what it looks like was bronchitis. And,
yes, you did mention, and I very much appreciate your taking this amount of time with us, Tim.
Well, I was told I needed to exercise my lungs. You got me exercising my lungs here tonight. I look forward to visiting with you sometime during the campaign again. And
okay, I will look forward to it too. Okay, and anytime you want to come on, okay, if you'd like to contact me, you have a standing invitation.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. There are going to be a lot of big developments in the campaign. It'll be fun to come back on with you. I've been a big fan of yours for a long time, and Real Progressives. Like I said at the very beginning of the interview, you taught me a thing. You reminded me that under the Constitution, Congress can do a bit more for Citizens United for overturning it through legislation and dealing with that problem of the Supreme Court. So I often learn a lot when I'm tuning into you to hear you speak, and I love the guests that you have and that the others on Real Progressive have as well. And I just really appreciate you having me on. I know our campaign has gotten a lot of support from your viewers before. I hope folks will keep donating to us at timcanova.com. And
I'm sure we will, Tim.
And down the road, phone banking, things like that, and just spreading the word about the campaign that we're here to fight. We're going to keep fighting. And I just appreciate everything that you're doing.
Okay. Well, we would have ourselves a very, very big party if you won.
When I win.
Or perhaps I should say, when we win, we will have a very, very big party here, okay, at Real Progressives.
Thank you.
Because there's nothing that we'd like to see more than that happening.
Thank you. Thank you, brother. I appreciate it, Joe.
So thank you very much for coming
Happy
here
New Year
tonight.
to you. Love you
Happy
all.
New Year to you too, and I will let you go now, okay? I'll put you in the lobby.
Okay.
Have a good night and a great New Year.
Good night. Happy New Year.
Good night. Okay, so I'm still here, and I will still take some more questions if you like. I know it won't be as exciting as with Tim here also, but I'm still here for questions and comments for a little while longer. Alan Parker says postal banking can go forward with the approval of the Postmaster General. Well, that's interesting. I didn't really know that, but in any case, I doubt we'll get that out of Donald Trump, which is what would have to happen. Andrew Garland says, do you think Bitcoin is just as much a bubble as the USD? Do you think at some point our currencies won't mean anything if we keep depleting our resources while having a corporate totalitarian dictatorship? Okay. First, I think Bitcoin is a much more outrageous bubble than the US dollar. And we can see that only this year. It is ridiculous to compare the two. Okay. But the second part of your question, Andrew, do you think at some point our currencies won't mean anything if we keep depleting our resources while having a corporate but totalitarian dictatorship? I think the answer to that question is more subtle. That is to say, the value of our currency is ultimately based on the legitimacy of our government, because it is the legitimacy of our government and the basic respect that people have for the government and for the use of force it can bring to bear in specific situations that supports the taxation system. And even though taxes do not pay for anything specifically, as we've seen on these broadcasts time after time after time, still taxing has to take place to drive the value of the currency. If no one paid their taxes in dollars, then the value of the currency would fall to nothing. So, if we had a corporate totalitarian dictatorship which was no longer able to maintain order, then yes, our currency could lose its value in a very, very short period of time. Barring that sort of catastrophic type of situation, though, any situation in which normal business goes on, our currency will more or less actually maintain its value There are measures the government can take to avoid extreme inflation, hyperinflation. I'd be very surprised if in the normal course of events that inflation of the currency would ever go above 10% a year here in the United States. Okay, and that, okay, depending on what else we do in the economy, okay, and with policy, okay, is easily manageable. Of course, we have a long way to go to get there. And in fact, the way this country is going in the normal course of events, it's very unlikely that we'll hit more than 3, 4, 5%. No matter what happens, right now, okay, the rate of inflation is somewhere in the neighborhood of what? Maybe 2% a year or 1.5% a year or something like that. Given the policies of the Federal Reserve, it's been very hard to produce inflation here. And we learned from the Japanese case that with the central bank acting as it does, even when it tries to produce inflation by raising interest rates, it has a very difficult time in producing inflation. The same thing will probably happen here, even if the Federal Reserve continues to try to raise interest rates. It's doubtful that it will do that. And the reason why it's doubtful is because it's already worried about a recession. And the thing it does in a recession is to back off interest rates. So that's likely to happen. So Gus Martin says, isn't the student debt owed to the Federal Reserve? No, a lot of it is still owed to banks, okay, and not to the Federal Reserve. But whoever it's owed to, our government can have a debt jubilee for students if it wants to have that. It can afford that. It can make it a matter of policy. What we need is to advocate for it and to pressure for it and to get that as a matter of public policy. Now, Tim said enough, okay, for you to know that he greatly wants to ease the burden for students. He hasn't talked about a debt jubilee yet. Actual forgiveness of the debt, probably because there are priorities like the climate change priority, the job guarantee priority, and the Medicare for All priority that are higher than the student debt priority. However, it's also clear that he does think student debt and easing the burden on students is a very high priority for the United States. He's very concerned, based on what he said, about the fact that our students are living with their parents and aren't able to start families. And I mean, I think anybody who's a sane person would be concerned about that. That is terrible, to place that kind of burden on the millennials. It is unconscionable. And Carfar says, Andrew, Bitcoin is a commodity, not a currency. Yes, quite right. It is not a currency. And the legitimacy of Bitcoin is a fluctuating thing. And since it's not forced on anyone, the fluctuations of legitimacy, okay, of Bitcoin are wholly reflected in its price. Okay, now I'm not saying one can't make a lot of money, okay, on Bitcoin. In other words, people who took on the recommendation of Max Kaiser, okay, in 2011 to buy Bitcoin when it was $3 a coin are very rich today, okay, because there are always bubbles in the economy, and there have been bubbles like this in the past. The tulips craze, okay, in Holland, was that in the 16th century, I think, or something like that? Lots of cases where things had just rocketed up out of control. But the big thing about those kinds of bubbles is We don't know when they're going to occur. We have to guess. We don't know when they're going to end. We don't know when the crash is going to come in. So when you buy into something like that, if you want to take a flyer, it is a flyer. You do it with money you don't need and that you're prepared to lose, because you can't predict when it's going to collapse and when you're going to lose and how much you're going to lose. And even when you start to lose, you don't know when the time is to get rid of it. There's an idea, okay, that many people have. Well, I'll hold and hold and hold, and this is going to blow over. And of course, if you've already bought in at, say, 3, and it's up at, I'm not sure what the latest figure is, 13,000, 14,000, 16,000, okay, whatever the price of a Bitcoin is, okay, and it starts going down, it goes down to 10,000, well, then the question is going to arise, should you sell it when it's in 10,000? You still would realize an enormous profit, but, people have faith. Well, it's down for a little while, but it's going to go up to 30,000. Max Kaiser says eventually it's going to top out at 100,000. How he knows that, I have no idea. I'm sure he doesn't have any kind of model for it. He's just guessing off the top of his head, making headlines, earning good money at RT for making pronunciations like this. Okay. And of course, he's laughing all the way to the bank as he profits from the $3 investment that I presume he made. Okay. In any case, it's just a game with Bitcoin. You have to view it as a game. You have to view it as gambling. Okay, and then decide how much money you want to gamble. Steve Wash says, the Fed is not printing money. They can add zeros to balance sheets. However, what they're actually doing is letting the banks lend out money at a higher ratio to money they have on hand. It's called quantitative easing. Yes, Steve, that's what they've been doing to build up the banks again and to take them out of crash territory. They've been basically subsidizing the banks. And Andrew Garland says, regardless of climate change, we can't keep depleting resources at an unsustainable rate. Our economy is incredibly wasteful, thus it doesn't economize anything. Our system is simply colonialism expanded. Sorry if I'm annoying the other commentators, but no one would watch my show since not many know me here on Cape Cod. Andrew, you are right about the unsustainability of our use of resources in our economy. You're right about the incredible waste in the economy. And that our system is simply colonialism expanded. We have to end all that. And real progressives in the United States are for ending all that. So I think we completely agree on that. What we don't agree with you about is items of currency, okay, and monetary theory, and also fiscal policy. But I think we probably do agree on questions of sustainability. Okay, I think that this particular group that you're watching now and this particular broadcaster, very strong on sustainability, sustainability issues. Okay, so there's been a lot of discussion with Andrew here, who seems to be very simpatico with us on many, many, many issues, but who seems to have some disagreements on the MMT-related issues. Well, I certainly think we can tolerate those disagreements, and we can work with Andrew on the many things that we agree about. Okay, David Strider for the U.S. Senate says, we are at war with austerity. Andrew Garland says glass, Bastigo. I was very interested in Tim's idea on a glass Stiegel Act for the mass media and for broadcasters and for the internet. I really couldn't agree more about that. Sheila Spatz asked, this is live? Well, we apparently are live because people keep on making comments. So we are apparently still live and have been live since 8 o'clock tonight. And we still have 52 people here sticking with us. Sam Hollenbeck says, yes, Andrew, if we stop waging global warfare, all of that labor, military personnel, manufacturing of supplies, weapons, and the raw materials that go into the military could be used for higher public purpose. I think we certainly all agree on that. And David Strider seems to agree also. He says, as will I. Mark Fabian says, Elizabeth Lynn, if there's something you don't understand, just ask. We all were in that same place not so long ago. And James W. Nicholas says, yes, get Joe to testify. Thanks, folks. I'll be happy to testify. I don't even have to travel very far to testify, at least not to Congress. People are expressing a lot of liking for Tim Canova. Well, you can tell I really like him, too. It seems like we're two peas in a pod, he and I. So, Barbara Wernick says, one-to-one with Dr. Joe. Joe says something. Dr. Joe always has his ducks in a row. Well, thank you, Barbara. I'm not sure that's correct, but I try to have my ducks in a row. Yeah, and also Tim did very well in a one-to-one with me. I mean, I think that Tim, okay, is very like me in background, okay, in education, in origin. He's a New Yorker. I'm a New Yorker. Okay, at least, well, I'm a New York City guy. He's from the island, but there are a lot of attitudes in common. Certainly, we have a similar background with history. I don't mean our personal history, but I mean our knowledge of history. Joy Marie Mann says, yeah, Dr. Joe, we knew you when. Yeah, we knew you when, Joy, also. Dr. Joe comes with the swiftness, as we say around here. Oh, gee, I thought I come with the slowness, but all right. Never heard anybody say I come with the swiftness, but thank you. And Molly Scarborough said, that's what I love and trust about real progressives. They do live videos, and there's no 1% they're paying them to do it. No, there isn't any 1% paying us to do it. And Dave Strider says, if the Navy and Marines had been deployed after the hurricane to Puerto Rico, the last loss of life would be minimized. I completely agree. I mean, the actions of the federal government have been entirely reprehensible in this. I mean, the Trump administration has just been a scandal in this respect also. I think it's a continuing scandal all the time. Okay, let me get to some of the most recent comments. Sandra Geisler asks, would you please discuss your feelings on the differences between a UBI and a BI okay, or big. Yeah, okay. The big is a basic income, but guarantee. Uh, Now, it can be expressed in different ways. MMT people generally feel that the job guarantee is the most important of the two policies. Okay, and the reason for that is that according to surveys and polling data and performance in the past, most people would like to work at something meaningful. Work provides a social environment and a connectedness to the community people value, and the institutions surrounding work are therefore valuable to people. So, what we believe is that if you offer a job guarantee and then you offer a basic income guarantee to people who don't want to go into the job guarantee, who can't find a job in the private sector, and who aren't able to find a job in the public sector, okay, then we do believe that there should be a basic income guarantee for people who don't want to work in the other three sectors and for people who can't work in those other three sectors, okay? Because there are such people. Okay, in my estimation, we'd probably find maybe 5 million people in the population that would fit into such a category. We don't want them to fall through the cracks. We want a safety net, okay, to be there for them. We don't think the amount that's paid to them in relation to this particular safety net should be at the same level as the job guarantee, which is the true living wage level. But it should still be at a comfortable subsistence level. So we put it at 2/3 of the job guarantee. Okay, I put it at 2/3 of the job guarantee. Okay, in my proposal. Okay, now notice that I'm talking about job guarantee, okay, across the country of maybe $18 an hour on the average. So I'm talking about a basic income guarantee of 2/3 of that, which would be the equivalent of $12 an hour, which would be paradise compared to the living wage today. Okay, so what the universal basic income people are saying that everybody should be entitled to a basic income, whether they are rich or poor, or whether they have jobs, okay, in other areas, or don't have jobs in other areas. In some proposals, states whatever age they are. And so what those people often advocate is each of the 325 million people in the United States should have a universal basic income, okay, of $1,000 a month, let's say. Now notice, $1,000 a month is only $12,000 per year. So when we talk about a basic income of $2 per hour for people who don't fit into the other slots, we're talking about close to $25,000 a year for our basic income. So it's much more livable than what the UBI is actually proposing, okay, but far more livable. But one of the major objections to the UBI is that, just apart from the fact that it doesn't provide any connectedness to the community, but leaves people, okay, as individuals, unconnected to anything, basically. Also, by guaranteeing to everybody $1,000 a month, you create a situation where a demand of $1,000 a month from everybody is guaranteed by the federal government, and where the prices in the economy over a period of time, a relatively short period of time, probably 2, 3, 4 years, are going to adjust to the new level, okay, that everybody has at least $1,000 a month to spend. So the basic income solution for people to ease their way if they need money, is only a temporary solution, because inflation is going to adjust to that. We know that's going to happen, okay? And so that's one of the major objections to it. Okay, but another objection to the UBI is that, well, Donald Trump would get a UBI, and Donald Trump's kids would get a UBI, and the same UBI, and but the people on the job guarantee, okay, would also get a UBI. So instead of getting something like $38,000 a year out of the job guarantee, they would get another $12,000 a year coming out of the UBI. So they would now be getting $50,000. Okay, and also middle income people, would be getting an extra $12,000. In other words, if someone had a family income of $80,000, let's say, or something like that, okay, so they'd be getting another $12,000. Okay, so the point is, everybody would be getting the same thing, and the result of that is to initially lift the level of consumption, okay, but prices are sure to follow that, because it's an upsurge that never stops and goes across the whole economy. Okay, it applies to everybody in the economy. So what's the cost of that on a per year basis? Well, it turns out that it's just short of $4 trillion. Now, why do we consider $4 trillion a major cost? Well, I hinted at that, okay, a little earlier in the broadcast. We have right now, given the state of the economy, what probably will amount to $2 trillion to $2.2 trillion of deficit spending policy space in our economy. So all that policy space and more is eaten up by the $4 trillion that would be spent on a UBI. Now, compared to that, the job guarantee and BI programs combined are likely to cost $1 trillion or less. If started in a recession, then they would cost about $1 trillion. But as they kicked off the economy in the recession, the cost would go down to $500 billion a year. So it's something like $500 billion a year. Some emitters even say $250 billion a year, compared to $4 trillion a year. So it eats up an enormous amount of policy space that we have to devote to other things, like Medicare for all, like the climate change programs, like our education programs, like student debt programs. Though the federal government, okay, according to MMT, can pay for whatever it wants to pay for, it cannot pay for so many things that it causes inflation in the economy. It can't spend or deficit spend past the full employment point in the economy. Okay, so that's the situation, and that's why we oppose a UBI but why we favor a job guarantee combined with a BI, expanding the safety net. In our concept, the expansion of the BI or the introduction of the BI would come about through an expansion of the Social Security program. That's the program that would actually administer the BI. Okay. The job guarantee program, on the other hand, would be a separate program funded through the federal government, funded through a new agency in the federal government that would handle that, probably somewhere inside of the Department of Labor. Okay. So that's what would happen there. Okay, it's almost 3 hours now. Oh, so Rob Rivera says, "Hey Yoda, would you be in favor of public ownership of the fiber optic internet infrastructure and lease the use to private companies like in France? Currently, they have well over 150 ISPs, and the average price is around $30. I don't know. I might be in favor of it. It would, really depend on the details of the proposal. Okay, I don't know off the top of my head. I'd be in favor of it compared to what we have now. I'd be in favor of it in a New York second compared to what we have now. But I don't know how I feel about it in competition with alternative policy. Alternatives like, okay, for example, have public ownership of the internet entirely, and have the service providers be public companies also. I'm not sure. I wouldn't actually think that that's something more preferable than giving private companies, giving them a chance to continue to profit off what is essentially a utility, a public utility. Okay. We have too much of that already, and I would like to end a lot of it. It doesn't work. It just drives up our prices. What I would do is make companies that are performing a public utility kind of function now, I would make them prove that they're operating for public purpose. And if they couldn't do that, then I would socialize those companies and make them publicly owned corporations. That's what I would do. I don't know if Tim would go that far, okay, or whether he would agree with that. Okay, the test that I use to evaluate all these things is the public purpose test. Is the corporation fulfilling a public purpose? And that's especially true with large corporations. With small businesses, it's a different test. It's different kind of thing. But with the large businesses, I think it has to fulfill a public purpose, or it has to be broken up so that it's subject to a market that really works. Okay, folks, I am getting tired. I've been on here for 3 hours now. And my wife, Bonnie, is reminding me that I've been on for 3 hours. And that she is now missing me. And so I'm going to say goodnight, but I'm getting a question from Brian Reynolds. Do rising wages cause inflation? Well, it depends on how much they rise in relation to the productivity of the economy. In our economy, we have a situation where the minimum wage would have to go up to something between $22 an hour to $26 an hour to keep pace with the productivity gains in the U.S. economy since the early 1970s. So we have an awful lot of room before we have a danger of generalized inflation caused by rising wages. A lot of room, since our minimum wage today is only $7.25. Only 1/3 of what our minimum wage ought to be. So Brian Reynolds, there's not much to worry about from rising wages in terms of an inflationary context. And if you think that's not true, look it up. I think you need an economic model to show me why it's not true. And it had better be a pretty darn good model, because most of the people who are fearful, okay, of inflation happening, just sort of wave their hands and say, inflation, inflation, inflation. You know, it's like, oh, don't do this because the boogeyman will get you. Okay? It's a boogeyman type of argument. They don't have any models that show anything like this. Okay? All their models, based on the ISLM model, have just fallen by the wayside. They don't prove anything. Why doesn't QE cause inflation? Well, QE doesn't but cause inflation because QE isn't adding any net financial assets into the economy. In QE, what the Federal Reserve does is it buys assets that are valued at by some particular dollar value, and it pays the price of that asset based on its accounting value to the holders of the asset. In most cases, they're the government bonds. Okay, so you're replacing government bonds with reserves on the theory that that's going to goose the loan market. Okay, but the loan market doesn't have anything to do with whether reserves are sitting at a bank or not, because when the banks have to make a decision about whether to issue a loan or not, they make it based on the creditworthiness of the customer, and they create the deposits in the act of making the loan out of thin air. Okay, the deposits are given in return for the note. And what they involve is marking up the borrower's account at the bank. That's all that happens. Okay? They don't go into a loanable funds market and see whether the reserves are available in the loanable funds market first and then decide on whether they make the loan. They make the loan first, and then they see about getting the reserves from the loanable funds market, okay, if they need to. That is to say, they go to other banks to see if they can get those reserves. And if the reserves are tight in the overnight market, then they go to the Fed and they get the reserves at the discount window. The Fed always guarantees they can have the reserves because it doesn't want to cause a liquidity crisis in the market. Okay, and the reserves we're talking about, those reserves are reserves at the Federal Reserve Bank. They never leave the Federal Reserve Bank, and they can't be used for anything except to trade with other banks in the overnight markets for reserves. That's their whole function in the economy. It's a cushion. Okay? So QE doesn't do very much to goose the economy because it's not creating financial wealth, and that's why it does not cause inflation. Okay. So anyway, I promised a moment ago I would say good night. So now I am finally going to say good night. Thank you all very much for attending. I will have some more live streams, and you'll be able to ask your questions again on the live streams. Thanks very much for coming. The attendance tonight, was really great. It's still great. I mean, even now, there are 51 people who are watching the broadcast.
52, I'm here.
Okay. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you for a great stream, and thank you for all the questions. Okay, and good night to you, Kathy Langen. And thank you very much for your contribution, too. Okay, when I get off here, I'll be posting the details for Real Progressives and for my books and for our Patreon accounts, so you can look up the details on that. And everybody have a very, very happy New Year. Okay, I know that I will, and I hope that every one of you has it too. So thank you again for coming, and good night until next. Well, it might be the middle of next week. It'll probably almost certainly be next Saturday, however, as long as the creeks don't rise, as the old saying goes. So thank you and good night. Okay, now, to answer your question, the reason why I couldn't answer it is I couldn't stop the program to answer this.
Okay. What happened was when you were talking to him, just before this half-hour thing, both of you were stopped. I could hear no speaking at all. And all the way through to now, there was no sound at all. There were things where your picture and him.
Okay, so let me start to give my answer, because what you're saying isn't significant.
Your picture would freeze. Then you might get a movement, maybe a few minutes.
Okay. The reason why I say it's not at all significant is because the broadcast was obviously continuing to go on perfectly well.
No.
There were no, listen to what I'm saying, will you?
Yeah.
People here were not telling us that there was a problem with the picture or a problem with the sound.
How could you have
So in other words,
here and not for everybody else?
Because you're getting it on the TV. You're not getting it on Facebook. It's taking another step.
I tried to get it on Facebook. I couldn't.
Well, I don't know.
That was some older thing.
It's having to do with okay. You wouldn't get this broadcast. You wouldn't get this broadcast on Facebook, okay, unless you went to the Real Progressives page. Okay. I don't know. I can't explain it. All I'm telling you is that it had to be local to our internet here in the house. The reason why is because nobody else reported any problem like that.